across the UK. On DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
And yes, good afternoon. Welcome back to the home of common sense. Thank you to Julia. She returns tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, 3 minutes after 1 now. So Reform UK's civil war rages on, with police launching an investigation into allegations of a series of verbal threats allegedly made by suspended MP Rupert Lowe. We're going to look at that in a couple of moments and also get into that question of how do disgruntled Reform voters now vote if there were an election tomorrow. Also this afternoon, there are fears a Palestinian migrant who filmed himself crossing the Channel and has called on God to kill all Jews could remain in Britain due to human rights laws. I mean, you really cannot. You can't even begin to make this stuff. It's beyond parody if it wasn't so darn serious. And speaking of which, the Sentencing Council has rejected the Justice Secretary's request to scrap rules accused of creating two-tier sentences by creating lighter punishment for ethnic minority and transgender offenders. Yeah, you heard all that correctly. This is the kind of upside-down, God-forsaken world we have found ourselves in. Welcome to the home of common sense, where we can counter a lot of this nonsense. 0344 499 1000. Serious question. If you are done with reform as a result of what's been happening, who would you vote for then? Where does that leave you in that respect? The plot thickens over there at Reform HQ. We now have even a greater dividing line between what happened last night. Nigel Farage doubled down, talked about Rupert Lowe creating problems. Rupert came out fighting. He said all accusations against him are nonsense. And in the last hour, the Met Police have launched an investigation into Rupert Lowe over allegations of verbal threats. Again, Mr. Lowe denies all of these claims. He's now instructed his lawyers to deal with this and said he's made them aware of my willingness to cooperate in any necessary investigation. So earlier today, there was a curious twist. It's full of kind of twists and turns. There's 7 staffers who've worked with Rupert very, very closely over time, sent an open letter declaring that he is a good, decent and honest man. They don't recognise the way he's being described as some kind of angry bully in any shape or form. And then again, we move to the next twist. Ben Habib, the former deputy leader of Reform, he famously fell out with Mr. Farage a little while ago. Now, he's re-entered the ring, hinting, and it was a hint, that he and Rupert Lowe could set up a whole new party. He gave an interview with The Telegraph, and he said, ultimately, the reason I joined Reform and the reason I stood for Reform in Wellingborough is because the only way you can make a difference is electorally. He said, you've got to be at the ballot box and hold the electoral system to account. So I think the answer is yes when asked about whether he would consider some kind of pact. How would that pan out? Because you're now into the territory of dividing the right again. And then there's the members and the supporters. And this is interesting. I know you can't really, fully judge by social media, etc. But I see a lot of accounts that I either follow or follow me, and they come across the timeline of people that I think you could reasonably call, die-hard Reform members and supporters, those people who actively campaigned for the party, enthusiastically voted for the party, have continued to tweet and show support for the party. Those people who've kind of now gone by the wayside. I mean, I can't tell you how many of those people are done with Reform and pointing the finger at Nigel Farage on this, not on Rupert Lowe. Literally giving up their membership, saying, that is it. This is the final straw. This is not the party I want to be part of. It's not the party I voted for. Which brings us to that question then. How would you vote if you're done with Reform? How would you go in that direction? We know there's a by-election on the way in Runcorn and Helsby, triggered after professional left-wing half-wit and now street boxer Mike Amesbury decked a constituent and then got sent to jail for his troubles. Reform came second, by the way, at the general election. About 19% of the vote. They did incredibly well. They've had their eye on, before all of this debacle happened with Mr. Lowe and Mr. Farage, they'd already had their eye on this seat. Will that make a difference? Do you know, the smart money to me says I don't think it will. I think when push comes to shove, if you ask shall we say disgruntled or disappointed or devastated Reform voters who now feel really let down, I think, for a number of reasons. I think the sense that a party that only has a handful of MPs could have split so spectacularly, and their two main players, not some backbencher you never heard of, their two main players. I mean, you have to remember that Rupert Lowe was responsible, I think I've got this stat right, for 46% of all questions, written and verbal, that have been asked by Reform since the general election. 46%. That's how active Rupert Lowe was in really advancing. I mean, he was paid to be an MP. He was elected to be an MP. And boy, you know, even if you don't like the cut of his jib, he has worked tirelessly on all of those areas that he thinks are absolutely crucial. Elon Musk came out a few months ago now and said that he's the man to lead the party. I think, to be honest, that's probably where the rot set in. He's a successful businessman. He doesn't take prisoners. He doesn't get involved in, you know, tittle-tattle. I'm sure he isn't a guy that takes well to being told what to do. But nonetheless, you cannot in any way detract or dilute the passion for the very things that got him elected. And that's the point, isn't it? It's a democracy. He was elected because people liked the cut of his jib. They liked what he said. They liked the way he operated. They liked his delivery, his passion. If you remove that from the party, 46% of what Reform have been doing in Parliament has gone. So he now works independently. He's a solo MP without a party. The whip has been removed. Now the old bill are investigating. And as I said to Julia, I think for many people, it isn't just the fact that the Messi and Ronaldo have spectacularly fallen out. Two big beasts that were on the team sheet has been reduced to one. That is troubling for many people. I think more than that, many Reform voters just don't like the way this has happened. It's the sort of thing you might expect would happen, you know, in the Labour Party or even the Conservative Party. Reform don't rub along like this. They don't operate in this fashion. They're the kind of party that would sit down, have a few pints and work it out. Might have an arm wrestle over a game of cribbage or something. They wouldn't certainly be calling the police for name calling. And of course we don't know the details, to be fair, but you get my point on this. So if you are a person that was that die-hard, passionate, enthusiastic, smiling at the new horizon of British politics, a Reform voter, how would you vote now if there was a general election? If you're in the constituency of Runcorn and Helsby, will you still vote Reform despite what has happened? I sense most people will. You know, it happens at elections, you know, when Labour members or Tory members are upset with their party, they don't like the way it is, they still vote for it. I wonder if the same thing will happen here. 0344 499 1000 is where you will find us. Let's get a word on this and the other big stories of the day. Candice Holdsworth, the writer and broadcaster, is back with us. Candice, how are you doing?
Good to be on.
Nice to have you with us again. I mean, this is just turning into a right royal mess. I mean, it started out as, oh, this is a bit interesting, and then it got, hang on a sec, this is a bit serious. And then, oh, look, it's very serious. Hang on a second, we've lost an MP. There's only 5 of us. 1 has gone, a 5th has disappeared. We used to say you could fit Reform MPs into a black taxi. Now you can fit them in a minicab. I mean, it's getting smaller by the hour. They're facing turmoil here, slump in the polls, escalating feud, of course, between Lowe and Farage. Allegations of bullying, internal disputes have rocked the party as it prepares for that key by-election. Let's have a listen, though, Candice, to Ben Habib, the former deputy leader, speaking on Talk this morning about the tensions between the two men.
No genuinely Samsonite, Herculean people, the kind that are required to save this country, will be allowed to flourish in Reform under Nigel. And to try and destroy Rupert, not just discredit him, but to destroy him, is unacceptable. And therefore, Nigel Farage should resign from Reform.
And I'm hearing a lot of that, Candice. I don't know whether that's the right thing to do, but certainly from some of the most passionate Reform supporters that I know or follow me on social media are saying exactly that.
That's such an interesting point because you can look at this in one of two ways. So some people have said that the impact of this to reform's support or growing support will be minimal because someone like Nigel Farage has huge name recognition, but someone like Rupert Lowe doesn't. But reform really depends on its passionate supporters.
Yeah.
Really engaged supporters who are driving a lot of this growth and a lot of this momentum, and a lot of them are online. And where are Ben Habib and Rupert Lowe, very influential, online, they have massive followings. So when they start speaking out like this, people will listen to them because they're two very well-liked people. And I think the general perception is, why wasn't this sorted out behind closed doors? We hate to see this happening between people that we really like and we really respect.
I do wonder whether this ultimately, in terms of people's electoral intentions, whether it ultimately does make a difference. When, you know, push comes to shove, you go to the ballot box and you think, look, I know I got angry on Twitter about this. I know I said Nigel should resign. I know I said I'll never vote for them again. But when you're looking at that, you know, there's the ballot paper in front of you. You've got all the names there. You're not going to tick Labour, probably not Conservatives or Lib Dem. Do you think people will just revert back to where their real passion is?
I'm wondering with this Runcorn by-election whether the preferences are baked in, like you say. I mean, that's what they said they're going to do. They're not going to switch right now. I mean, that would just be too radical. It would be too much of a psychological shift. Yeah. So will they stick with reform? I think we'll only be able to measure based on the results that come out. So if reform significantly underperform, then I think we could quite reasonably say, okay, this had an impact. I think what will be difficult to interpret is if they lose by just a small amount, and then we won't really be able to, and it could be any number of factors. I think it's going to be over the longer term in terms of maybe much slower growth, a consistent drop in the polls, then we can maybe say confidently that this is having an impact.
Yeah, indeed. And if you look at the current MP, Mike Amesbury, who, of course, you know, decked a constituent in the street, he got a 14,000 majority or something. In all likelihood, Labour's vote is going to go down anyway, partly because of Fisty McDougall and his antics in the street after a beer, but also that, you know, 6-7 months into a new government, it's been a bit tricky for Labour. His numbers will go down anyway. So, but I mean, there is a possibility that despite everything, reform could still get this. I mean, they beat the Tories, so the Tories are likely to be nowhere in this by-election.
I know, and a lot of people have been saying that the Conservatives must be loving this, a kind of unforced error. So, you know, something that's not to do with them, they're instead who they're trying to manage, because, I mean, they're, you know, that's who they're losing support to on their right to reform. Fighting has broken out amongst them. It's a huge gift to the Tories. They don't even have to do anything. But you're right, this is very much a race between Labour and reform, and it's between the two of them. And it will be interesting to see just how disillusioned Labour voters in the North are with Labour, and enough so that they still stick with reform or maybe stay at home, or if Labour's, you know, going to be able to Labour will just lose just a little bit of support, not too much. I just think unless you have significant shifts, it's very difficult to interpret, to say confidently that this was the event that did it. I think that those sorts of the ability to link events, to causally and to correlate events like that is not easy.
Indeed. Let's move to this story, Candice. Staggering, the gun-toting, Jew-hating Palestinian migrant that we're aware of might be able to remain in the UK due to human rights laws. This is Abu Wadi, arrested on Sunday, just 3 days after he crossed the channel from France in a dinghy. But Home Office guidelines restrict anyone being sent back to Gaza, which is where this character is from. I mean, let's just remind ourselves, you know, don't worry if you think the government aren't tough on this kind of thing, because they really are very, very tough indeed, Candice. And if you need any proof of that, have a listen to the Prime Minister.
You will have helped to smash the gangs, secure our borders, and save countless lives. Smash the criminal gangs, and they are criminal gangs, that are running this vile trade and putting people in the boats. Take those gangs down. I think smashing the gangs that are taking people's money is a deterrent. I think you have to smash those gangs. The only way to stop that is to smash the gangs that are running this vile trade. Smash the gangs.
And that's all he says, really. Smash the gangs. He hasn't really got a view on people like Abu Wadi in any shape or form, Candice. And you know what? If the government, if Keir Starmer tomorrow said that fella that we know has got previous in terms of inflammatory, very dangerous, lethal language, he's currently, you know, in a jail somewhere, let's just go and get him and we're going to fly him over to the border and send him back to Gaza, then I tell you what, that by-election we've just been talking about, people would vote Labour because they go, finally, you've done something that makes sense. But we're told it's our old friend human rights that might stand in the way.
Yes, I thought the chicken nugget story couldn't get any worse than that, but it sort of it goes from the farcical to the sinister. I mean, this is truly sinister. I mean, we know what this person is capable of and what his thoughts are based on his social media history. But how many people coming over think like this, have done terrible things, and we know nothing about them?
Yep.
And they're in. And I think that this strengthens what Robert Jenrick said, that, you know, certain human rights laws should disapply to people who enter illegally. The fact is that we just have to be super, super, super tough. It has to be that if you arrive here by boat, you cannot stay in this country and you're not able to apply for all this human rights relief. We have to do that. Yeah. There is no other way to manage incentives. You can go on about smashing the gangs, but as long as you have all these pull factors, people will still keep arriving.
Yeah, and if you come from a region where the government in that region are literally a terrorist organisation, then you've got zero chance. You know what? Sadly, whatever yes, I'm sure there's some desperate people who don't support that government that would rather get away from it. But we can't play those kind of risky rules. But that's the sort of voice we're not getting from the government. That's the kind of thing that Rupert Lowe was championing and talking about incessantly with big support. And that's where we're at now. But it could be human rights that keep this man in the country. Again, this is a long list of stories on the back of Chicken Nugget Gate under the banner of you really cannot make it up. Candice, stay with us. More from Candice Holdsworth in a couple of moments' time. We'll talk about that two-tier sentencing story. Mobile phone theft reaching an all-time high as well. Details on the way. 0344 499 1000. And the question we threw out at the beginning, if you are done with reform, if that's how you passionately feel, how would you vote if there was an election tomorrow? This is Talk.
Well, we have absolutely no idea. It's just mind-boggling because this is, you know, it's not unusual that there would be an inquiry into something as grave as this, where there's so many unanswered questions. And I mean, Southport immediately had an inquiry, and obviously that is exactly what should have happened in that situation. And then Nottingham was given an inquiry a couple of weeks ago. So why on earth can't we have an inquiry?
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
There's also quite a lot of controversy over whether Reform's members are rising or dwindling. It's hard to tell. You can't go by the website, by the way, because there's no way of accurately being able to say that reflects what people... Anecdotally, some people are saying, yeah, I'm rescinding my membership. I don't know whether it will ultimately make a massive difference. Marco says, spot on with everything you said about Rupert Lowe. I think it's worth pointing out that he has done all of this while donating his salary to charity. I can't believe what Reform have done. Calling the plot. I wouldn't trust the chairman as far as I could throw him. People will always have the... Thank you, Marco, for that. There is absolutely that sense of outrage as to what is happening, and Rupert Lowe in particular, who was the kind of big star of the Five. I think that's probably where some of the trouble began as well. Let's go to some other stories. Candice Holdsworth is with us, the writer and the broadcaster. This is the two-tier story, Candice. The Sentencing Council have now refused demands from the Justice Secretary to scrap that guidance. We broke this story about a week ago now that could result in ethnic minorities or transgender offenders receiving lighter sentences. The dispute has sparked a heated debate over judicial independence and fairness in the legal system. Now it's worth having a listen and a reminder to the Shadow Justice Secretary, Robert Jenrick, speaking about this very issue of two-tier justice. Here he is.
Turning to the new sentencing guidelines that's been published alongside this statement, which will make a custodial sentence less likely for, and I quote, ethnic minorities, cultural minorities, and faith minority communities. Why is the Justice Secretary enshrining this double standard, this two-tier approach to sentencing? This is an inversion of the rule of law. We on this side of the House believe in equality under the law. Why doesn't she?
This is a bit strange, Candice, because the government can't do anything about it because they're not the Sentencing Council, and the judiciary is, independent of government in that respect. I mean, that seems... I get the idea of that because ordinarily, we're not North Korea. We don't want a minister telling everybody what a sentence should look like. But simultaneously, there's got to be a point when the government are able to clearly adjust something that's unjust.
Yes, you're right. You don't want total centralisation of power, and that's the idea behind having different bodies devise these guidelines. But the problem is when the quangos go so far beyond common sense or go so far beyond what most people would consider to be mainstream opinion. So, they've got these radical ideas about disparities in racial sentencing. It's obviously caused a great deal of outrage, and this is what's going on with, I think, quangos in this country. You see it with the Policing Council and the whole controversy around non-crime hate incidents. So, I would really question the legitimacy of those. Whenever one of them hits the stories about some kid getting recorded by the police for saying their classmate smells like fish, people just think, what is going on? And I think that what this is all sort of building up to is a clash between these quangos and the judiciary and Parliament, people we elect to Parliament to enact laws that represent the ordinary mainstream's opinion of the public. And this is going to continue on. And you saw when Kemi Badenoch, for instance, tried to question judges' opinions, they said respect the impartiality of the judiciary. But like I say, as soon as these judgments go beyond common sense, then I think you do need a challenge from Parliament, and you do need a challenge from elected officials. You know, we assume that all the power should necessarily be taken away from Parliament and that people outside of it should have a say. But what about the other way around, when you have these completely unelected bodies doing things that most people completely disagree with?
100%. And I think we can run away with this kind of romantic notion of, the judiciary is independent in the sense that we've just both articulated, but simultaneously the idea that if you're the elected representative who's been given the role as justice minister, the idea you're meant to keep stum about what is palpably a ridiculous piece of information, a ridiculous piece of legislation or suggestion would be crazy. I mean, of course you've got to make your points known.
Yes, and that's what a democracy is. I mean, that's why we have all these different arms of government. And the problem is I think for most of these things, I think the best way to give them legitimacy, it's the same with the non-crime hate incidents as well, is they should be debated in Parliament. These ideas need to be debated in Parliament, because I think, like with prisoners' voting rights years ago, when the ECHR just tried to superimpose that on Parliament, it's ultimately parliamentarians that will suffer. They're the ones who have to bear the brunt of these ideas, because often it's the public that blames them.
100%. And here's another area that we should also be concerned about: mobile phone theft. Now, it's often seen as low-level crime, this. There's nothing low-level about it. It's intimidating, it's harrowing, it's inconvenient, and it's massively on the rise. This is a story, this just looks at the capital city, London. Record high in 2024, 70,137 phones stolen. That's up 40% from the year before. It's 191 phones a day. Thefts more than tripled in 4 years, rising, costing Londoners an estimated £70,000 annually. And this is often done with kind of criminal gangs. They're really stolen to order. They steal about 50 of them over the course of a day or so, stick them all in a bag, and they sell the lot. And away they go to places like Nigeria and China to be reconned and sold on. It's a big business in that respect. It's not a small crime. It's not a minor crime. I think you should be looking at a mandatory X amount of years in jail for this, just to put the message out there that we won't tolerate this. We've got to work at this like the broken windows policy, right?
I would completely agree with you on that. Absolutely. It's thought of as a low-level crime, but these are the crimes that most of us every day are exposed to. I mean, I've personally witnessed, I've seen someone have their phone snatched out of their hand. I remember I was coming back late at night on Finchley Road, and I saw someone who was clearly looking on, maybe he was ordering a car or he was looking on the map, and it just got snatched out of his hand. And I'll never forget the look on his face. And he sort of futilely chased this person down, trying to get his phone back. Yeah. And this is a guy who's now stranded in central London at 2 o'clock in the morning without his phone. I mean, that's a devastating thing to happen to you. And more people, it is happening to them. And it's sort of making us lose faith in law and order on the streets of London. I mean,
absolutely. It is, yes, it's not the same as having, somebody kidnapped from your family. We all get that. But that's not the only barometer of what is serious. And something that is so blazon as this, broad daylight thefts of, hundreds or thousands of pounds worth of phone sometimes. If you thought you were going to get 3 years automatically for that, then we might begin to see some kind of impact on these kind of numbers, which are terrible. Candice, we hit the clock, but thank you, as ever, Candice Holdsworth, the writer and broadcaster, with us. I want your comments on all of it. Did anybody ever get their phone back, by the way? Did anyone who had their phone nicked in that kind of snatch grab thing in the street ever get it back? I can't imagine anyone did, but if there is a case where you succeeded on that one or got justice for it, because I've got a feeling that if they nabbed somebody and they did, there was a case recently where I think it was quite industrial scale, where they found hundreds of phones and possibly the perpetrators went to jail. But if they found you with 3 phones stuck in your bag on your back because you'd nicked them, I don't think you'd be going to jail. I've got a funny feeling you might not even end up in court. 0344 499 1000. And this question, reference reform. If you're done with reform, who would you vote for? This from Don in Chelmsford. It says, people say they are leaving reform are being short-sighted. It will just ensure that we won't get rid of the worst government ever. which is a very good point. And of course, it then divides. If there was another party that came up, Rupert Lowe, Ben Habib, there's been sort of hints at that being a possibility. That's just going to divide it even more, isn't it? So you've got this sort of three-way split on centre right-wing parties, and possibly more to come. Who else is going to join another group? 0344 499 1000. Our lines are open. This is Talk.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
This from Susan, who says, you are a vile Jew-hating, jihad-supporting Muslim. What? I don't think she's referring to me, by the way. If you are, you... Why, I'm glad I clarified that. Why can't you be sent to Gaza? Surely you'd be happy, as you'd find a lot of friends there. What kind of human rights are the Home Office lawyers using to keep this person here? I mean, if that is the case, I don't think they are wanting to. The suggestion is that, because the Home Office will appeal this, if we're not at this stage yet, but if it comes to that, then certainly the first thing that a lawyer is going to do is say, well, my client can't be sent back to Gaza because they're human rights, and it's a region, it's not a country. Palestinian region is not a place we're allowed to send people back to. It's off the books, as it were. Derek says, how can I vote Labour when they've been diabolical since last July, not fulfilling pledges like Trump? And how can I vote Conservative if they've done nothing in 14 years, even with an 80 majority? It's still reform for me all the way. It's going to be interesting keeping our eye on Trump. And I would urge you to look at some of the American press. I mean, you have to be careful where you look, and you have to read kind of 2 or 3 different flavours, if you like, of a political reflection. But whether you're looking at the Washington Post, the New York Post, or wherever, have a little look at how the kind of deportation story is going, because there was a big flurry, if you remember, within days of Trump coming into power. The boys were going in and grabbing the bad guys and sending them back from whence they came. What's that looking like today, just weeks down the line? That's the momentum still being kept up on that? You might be surprised, might be disappointed by what you see. 0344 499 1000. So let's continue on that story of what is happening in Reform. They've dropped 2 points in the polls, not drastic, but they have, amid leadership tensions and internal disputes. Suspended MP Rupert Lowe now under investigation by the Met Police over alleged verbal threats to the party chairman, Zia Youssef. He denies the claims and calls it a witch hunt tied to migration policy clashes. Him and Mr Farage, you wouldn't think it, would you? This is Reform we're talking about. They have two very different ideas of how to deal with it. The party faces a tough test. There's an up-and-coming by-election in Runcorn and Helsby, triggered by the resignation of street fighter former Labour MP Mike Amesbury. Let's speak with James Hill, political correspondent over there at The Spectator. Afternoon to you, James. I mean, it's this kind of thing, and it keeps people like us busy and, you know, never-ending what seems feed of twists and turns in this curious story. In the last hour, the Met Police confirming they are investigating this allegation of verbal threats, not something that I think a lot of Reform supporters would have imagined to be the direction they would have taken this.
Yeah, absolutely, Ian. I think that that's what is so striking about this, is that it goes very much against the brand of Reform. You know, Reform have been very critical of people being referred to the police for so-called hurty words. They were very much at the forefront of the stories around non-crime hate incidents when those were revealed a few months ago. And yet, of course, we now have a situation where the chief whip has been involved with the party chairman in referring one of the MPs to the police. And so I'm fascinated to see how that goes. But I think it's something that a lot of people in Reform are saying, hang on a sec, why are you referring someone within our own organisation to Reform? And it's no surprise, into the police, sorry. And it's no surprise, therefore, that it's all really kicking off this afternoon.
And Mr Lowe, we should say, and continue to say, denies any kind of wrongdoing. He's got his lawyers now on the case. I guess the question that remains, we can safely say Rupert Lowe is not going back to Reform anytime soon.
Yes, and I mean, why would you, frankly, when, as you say, all those talk perhaps of how Reform had changed, it was a new party. I think a lot of critics are now saying we were right, we were vindicated. Clearly, there's only 5 of them. How on earth can they expect to be the next government of this country with 326 MPs when they can't even manage 5 of them? So it's the classic case, unfortunately, of a small party, big egos, and often that can prove fatal for them.
I know that you can't judge everything by social media. You can't write an accurate column based on kind of the echo chamber that is X or Facebook or wherever. But sometimes it is an interesting litmus test into, you know, what is happening out there, a mood of some people. There's definitely a lot of disquiet, many fingers pointing towards Nigel Farage as the problem here, suggesting he should go, not Rupert Lowe. And this all comes, of course, against the backdrop of a by-election being called. We were throwing out the question earlier, if you are a disgruntled Reform supporter, who would you vote for? We've seen this with other parties, James. I mean, invariably, the rule of thumb is that people do still revert to the party they love, right?
Yes, that's correct. And I think that basically the Reform Party is seen as the Nigel Farage party. It is too soon to tell whether this is really hurting them. I suspect the 2-point drop you said earlier was much to do about Russia and what's been happening there, and perhaps some of Reform's difficulties on that issue, than it is about Rupert Lowe. But I do think it is worrying because Reform are like a shark. They need to keep moving forward. They are someone whose base is much more online than the average traditional party. And therefore, they are very much aware of what's happening on social media. And that has been to the great benefit of Reform. They've obviously been able to ride their sort of social media presence very well over the past year. But of course, when they suffer a reversal, when they suffer an internal defeat, how can they reset from that? And I think you can see over the last week or so, Ian, the fact that they've been so reticent with interviews, the fact that you know, people like Nigel Farage's comments to ITV angrily lead to more questions demand more questions than answers, shows that Reform are in a bit of a bind on this one.
Yeah, I mean, it's not as if it's some kind of obscure backbencher we're talking about here. You know, Farage and Lowe were the sort of Messi and Ronaldo of the piece here. You don't want to lose either of them from your team sheet in an ideal world, but 50% has gone. Rupert Lowe, I saw somebody crunching the numbers, apparently was responsible for 46% of all the written and verbal questions to Parliament since last July. So he's been very, very active and prolific in that respect.
Yes, he certainly has. And I think that, my sympathy with reform is that it's very hard to do all the duties of being a national party with just 5 MPs, which is why they have these regional conferences, because it means that, one MP can speak to sort of 50 branches rather than have to do 50 different nights going around the country. But of course, it means that when you've got, Rupert Lowe thrown out the party, a lot of the burden will fall on Farage. And then you've obviously got Tice, Anderson and McMurdoch. And I think that for a variety of reasons, they're operating in a different way to Rupert Lowe. And Rupert Lowe was seen very much as the number 2 or 3 in reform. And so they've lost that. And he's going to be sat there on the back benches for the next 4 years, constantly being a thorn in the side of Nigel Farage. What happens? That's
going to be interesting. And whilst McMurdoch doesn't really speak for reasons we won't go over again now, it's this is a trio really of MPs that they've got. That could change, of course, with this by-election in Runcorn. 18% of the vote they got last time. Mike Amesbury, the street fighter, got himself 52, nearly 53%. That's, even if he hadn't had the punch up in the street with a constituent, it would be fair to say Labour's share of the vote would naturally go down. Tends to be the order of events if you throw a by-election in after a government's been elected. So Reform could still do well here, couldn't they? And if they do, that's real. There's a lot resting on this, not just the idea that you get an extra MP, or it would bring numbers back to where they were, but you also give out the perception, actually, this party is not dead. The Rupert Lowe thing was not a distraction. We're back in business.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd point out the geography as well, because, this would be one of those northwest Labour-facing seats. That would be very different to the profile of, say, McMurdoch in Essex or Farage in Clacton or Richard Tice in Boston. So I think that would be a very different profile and feel. It would also mean taking on one of Labour's top safe seats, somewhere where they won with an absolute majority, 52% last time, and going up against the rather formidable Labour Northwest campaigning machine. And so if they're able to do all of that while being on the back foot, that would be a huge fillip to them. And it'll also be interesting because this is the first by-election as Parliament, and we saw under the Tories that every by-election basically served as a referendum, and there was a lot of tactical voting where Labour and Lib voters were very astute, and they would just crush the Tory candidate every time for the past 3-4 years. What's going to happen this time, it remains to be seen, because, of course, the Tories were only 2% behind Reform last time. I still think Reform are quite confident about this, but there's no doubt this row has hurt them. Yeah, and I don't imagine the Tories getting into bed with the Greens to try, who came fourth, I think, in this, in order to offset this. I mean, what about this other suggestion, James, that it was hinted, Ben Habib, I think, was in an interview with The Telegraph, suggesting that, maybe there could be some kind of marrying up of Habib and Lowe and starting a whole new party? Well, I think that the situations in which Ben Habib and Rupert Lowe found themselves now are quite different, because obviously Rupert Lowe is an MP. Whatever happens, he's a man of considerable resources and a platform in Parliament. I think that those conversations are ones that are going to dominate for the next decade of British politics. I mean, I'm interested in Ben Habib's idea of having a great British, I think it's Political Action Committee, a bit like the American super PACs, and try and do a deal between the Tories and Reform. Right now, I am very sceptical about the prospects of another right-wing party, but I do think, a bit like the Canadian Conservatives, where, of course, this is where Nigel Farage got the name Reform from, the Reform Party ended up taking over the Conservatives and binding together. I wonder if something will happen like that in the long-term future, maybe in the next Parliament.
Yeah, or will Ben Habib put himself up as an independent in Runcorn?
I'm sceptical about that. I'm not sure how much of a following Ben had compared to Farage or Rupert.
That's very true. And, of course, it would be quite humiliating if Ben, did badly. It would kind of seal Mr Farage's belief that he's no longer relevant to politics. And I disagree with that, by the way, but that would be how Reform would sell it, of course.
Absolutely right, yeah.
We'll watch with interest. James, thank you. It's anything but dull. James Heal, political correspondent over there at The Spectator. Thank you to him. Barry says this. Barry is in Merseyside, says, wow, still going on about the Reform non-news row. Well, I wouldn't say it's non-news, mate. I mean, it's literally a huge turning point for Reform. As we're discussing it. Nothing, people, just a ripple in an ocean of change. Don't forget how woke, snowflake and anti to Indigenous UK people, Conservative and Labour are. Reform are strong. We want our country back. Keep the faith. The reason it's not non-news, firstly, there was a development in the last hour, is that this is a party that is projecting itself to literally win the next election from a starting point of 5 MPs. That means it's always going to be a relevant story, no matter what happens. If one of them so much as darns their own socks, it's going to be a story. But I think what changes this significantly, of course, is the migration debate, which is apparently one of the big sticking points, the big differences between Nigel Farage and Rupert Lowe. Mr. Lowe says, I will deport 1 million illegal immigrants. Nigel Farage says, well, you can't do that. And the lack of what some people see as intent and passion on, if you like, the bread and butter of their whole policy, their manifesto, immigration. If that is the case, then man alive, if Nigel Farage can't get that right, then who can? So there's more than one story there, Bazza, just to kind of fill you in on that. 0344 499 1000. Let's get a voice note on this very point from Judy.
As far as the Reform membership goes, I don't think it'll make any difference them having this little spat by 2 men. 2 men don't the party make, the members make the party. And I think they'll continue to go from strength to strength. I know he's criticised the leadership that Nigel Farage has, but you need someone strong. It's a bear pit in Westminster.
Well, it's certainly that. I mean, that would apply if it was just a small story. I mean, he's pretty much 25% of the entire parliamentary representation and the biggest player, arguably, alongside Farage. So that, again, changes it from being a sort of lowly bat. If it was the other fella that no one's really heard of, that you don't hear anything from because of his previous proclivities with his fists, then you could say, well, it's not going to make it, we don't know who he is anyway, so it doesn't make a difference. But it's not. It's their biggest player, responsible for most of their activity in Parliament. 0344 499 1000. If you're done with reform, who would you vote for? By the way, for the record, I don't think it will make a difference in terms of how people eventually vote. But we will see and watch, wait and see what happens in that up-and-coming by-election in Runcorn. Time now is 12 minutes to 2. This is Talk.
South Clifford, after the attack in which he killed those 3 women, he then shot himself with a crossbow and is now permanently paralysed. I know. I cried tears for him too. Of course I did. But the judge said the prospect of putting a man in a wheelchair, in restraints, and the disruption it would cause to proceedings meant that he chose not to do that. As far as I'm concerned, drag him out of his wheelchair, drag him up the stairs, into the court, into the box for the defendant, and if necessary, he's shouting and screaming, gag him. I don't care.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
This one comes from Luke, who says, afternoon, Mr. Collins. Regarding the illegal criminal migrant that can't be deported back to Palestine, if only we had an agreement with, say, a third-party country, perhaps somewhere far away from the UK, somewhere for situations just like this, maybe somewhere like Rwanda. That's a good idea, Luke. You should put that in the suggestion box. Maybe a party somewhere will pick that one up. Matthew says, I'm a member of Reform UK, but I've seriously been considering whether I should be after Zia and Nigel's complete self-destruction of the party over what looks like jealousy of the popular MP Rupert Lowe. I'll have to wait and see what happens next. If Rupert and Ben team up to form another patriotic party, I will be very tempted to join them. What a mess Farage has made. It's interesting that big animated voices like that. Matthew, thank you for that. And others saying there's nothing to see here, really. And it is true that in politics, even stories that look, quite big and substantial do eventually sort of disappear. And, a few hours down the line, you kind of forget that they even happened. Reform aren't going to be destroyed by this, but they've certainly been a bit compromised. I think integrity perhaps is central to the allegation against them at the moment, but we'll see how it pans out in terms of police action, because that is a big game changer. Back to your call. Shirley is in York on this question. Shirley, what are your thoughts? Good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, Ian.
Hi.
Yes, like Maggie has just said, I'm also a Reform member. I've recently joined Reform, and now I'm thinking of cancelling my membership because I'm just very disappointed with the way Nigel and Zia Youssef have handled this. I really wanted to believe Nigel was the answer to our problems in this country, like controlling our borders, ending wokeism, putting Britain first generally. And I just think this is a huge thing. I don't think it's something that's just going to go away.
Yeah.
I think it is a seismic, situation that's happened here, because Reform voters are different, I think, than your general.
You've just hinted at it there, Shirley. I mean, the kind of common sense approach to things, and bearing in mind how animated the Reform voice is on things like calling the police over a petty scrap, or non-crime hate crimes, all this kind of stuff. And here they are in this. I mean, again, we have to stress we don't know the details of the allegation. It might turn out to be something slightly more substantial. It may turn out to be absolutely nothing. And if that is the case, then this is going to make them look a bit daft, because this is central to who they are, isn't it? Reform don't do this kind of stuff.
That's right. So I think, yes, we do have to, keep our powder dry a bit until we find out exactly what's happened. Although I do think bringing the police in does seem to be ridiculous, and plus it's the Met Police. Let's remember what they're like, and the two-tier thing, and whether they'll be measured about it all, that's another thing. But I just think that with Nigel, I just feel like the shine has started to come off him and his brand, and he's watering things down, like his stance on immigration. Richard Tice feels like he's a little bit of a yes man when it comes to Nigel, and a bit of a watchdog, and the way he just, dismissed so many reform voters as that lot, when there was a big rally in London. I felt really peeved when he said that. I thought, how dare you say that? Because, I don't know everything about that rally and everything about that video that was shown. I think it was caught silenced. But still, I think a lot of reform voters would have had some, support of that, and therefore to dismiss everybody as that lot when there were a really great bunch of people who were patriotic, waving their flags.
Well, there was absolutely nothing wrong with those gatherings. I mean, showing that film and all that happened afterwards might be another issue, but you're absolutely right, Shirley. The get-together, people described it as more like a coronation event, like a big street party, and people of all different persuasions, creeds, colours, ages, gathering for that sort of, that sense. And I don't think you can write all that group of people off. Shirley, thank you very much indeed for that. Interesting one comes in here. Mr Collins, the common denominator with all the problems surrounding Reform and the Brexit Party and UKIP before them seems to be Farage and his ego. I mean, of course he has an ego. I get that. But yes, I can remember, God, years ago, I used to do a podcast with Gerard Batten. Gerard at the time was the leader of UKIP, and we did a podcast together. And I don't know whether I could say... Well, yeah, I think they probably did fall out. I'm being very, very polite here. There wasn't, I don't think, any love lost. And we know that, at the time when Mr Batten had taken over UKIP, and by the way, Gerard is just one of the most thoroughly lovely, decent, honest man I've ever met in politics. I like him a lot. He's a good guy. And I think he got a torrid time from some of his previous colleagues, shall we say. And I can remember being in a studio about to record the podcast, and Nigel was in the room next door, and he kind of popped his head in to sort of tacitly say hello. But it was a very awkward, weird moment. Because a similar thing had happened to Gerard in that respect. And of course, under the leadership of the Brexit Party and Mr Farage, they hoovered up those previous UKIP votes. I think something rather ungentlemanly happened, probably, in that moment. But I don't know the fuller details, but you take the point. This is Paddy in Sussex. We've not got long, Paddy, but I'm sure you can do it. What are your thoughts in 30 seconds, if you can?
OK, then. Farage, you've got to ask him, does he believe the mass migrations is good for the country or bad for the country? If he doesn't want repatriation, well, he might as well let them flood in then, organise a couple of planes.
It's interesting, isn't it, his take on it? I mean, the German... Merz, who's just become the German Chancellor, he previously said something like, well, we need lots of migrants, to do the work. And I wonder whether Mr Farage is taking a similar line.
Well, it's going to be a lot worse come the general election. These migrants will have the whip hand by then.
Well, we will see. I don't know if the next general election, but I take your point. Paddy, thank you very much indeed. I don't know how many of them would even be allowed to vote, but that's probably down to our current Home Secretary and Keir Starmer, so don't hold your breath on that one. 0344 499 1000. Our lines are open. Let's get the news headlines at 2 o'clock.
across the UK. On DAB+.
Yeah, good afternoon. Welcome back. It is the Home of Common Sense, 3 minutes after 2 o'clock. So reforms, civil war rages on. We now know in the last couple of hours, police launching an investigation into allegations of a, quote, series of verbal threats, unquote, allegedly made by suspended MP Rupert Lowe. I should tell you, Mr. Lowe denies all allegations against him. But we are asking the question, if you're done with reform, who would you vote for come an election? And there is a by-election creeping up in a matter of, well, weeks stroke couple of months. Also this afternoon, Prime Minister Keir Starmer has vowed to push ahead with benefits cuts, calling the welfare system unsustainable, indefensible and unfair. There is a bit of a Labour rebellion on this. I think there's about 80 backbenchers who are very, very unhappy. Can they be brought around in any sort of way? We'll look at that too. And Ukraine's launched what's been described as the biggest drone attack ever on Moscow overnight, killing at least 3 people as peace talks begin in Saudi Arabia. More on that as well. Everything you need to know, all the breaking news, right here on Talk 0344 499 1000. This in from Caroline in Staffordshire. Reform membership took a small hit during the past 2 days, but equally the membership ticker has been climbing again since yesterday. So there are still people wanting to join, even with the latest silly ego spat. Just so you know. I mean, we're aware of that. Obviously, we sit here in a newsroom, so I'm absolutely across that. But whether, again, we've had a few people say, well, what about the authenticity of the ticker? Do you remember that spat? Theo Usherwood is with us. Do you remember that debate?
I roll my eyes, yes.
The Kemi
you cannot for one moment question the authenticity of the ticker. It's been verified. It is 100% true, and
yeah.
Make no mistake about it.
Don't question the ticker.
Never question the ticker.
Never question the ticker. My old nan always used to say, don't question the ticker. So there it is. It's the bastion of truth. Who knows? But I said at the beginning, Theo, of all of this, I don't think ultimately, I mean, it is, in terms of political rows, bearing in mind it's a party that only has 5 MPs, or 4 active MPs, if you want to look at it in terms of media appearances, and 25% of that quartet has now gone. The man responsible, as we understand it, for about 46% of all questions asked, raised verbally and written in the House of Commons. Massive presence on social media, asking all that stuff that he would argue, Mr. Lowe would argue, these are the very things that my constituents voted me in for, so that's why I'm asking these questions. Very active. Nobody will take that away from Rupert Lowe. But we can't diminish this and say it's just it will go away, I believe that, but it's not a small row in reform.
No, it's not a small row, and it cuts to 2 fundamental questions about reform, and that is, from Nigel Farage's point of view, can he break through that 30% barrier in the polls? Can he appeal to the British public to the point at which he is actually a viable alternative to Keir Starmer as Prime Minister of this country? That's his aim, that's his goal, right? That he wants to be Prime Minister. And to do that, he needs to swing towards the centre. Rupert Lowe, on the other hand, represents core reform supporters. And that's okay. But he represents the hardline view. There are too many immigrants in this country. He wants to see mass deportations, and he thinks that those are the solutions that the British public want. But from Nigel Farage's point of view, he recognises that he can't go in with that narrative into the general election, or build up that narrative ahead of a general election, because he knows that if he does so, he's going to put off too many people. And so he wants to swing towards the middle. Rupert Lowe, of course, represents the base of the party. We saw the row and which way Elon Musk sided at the turn of the year, very much supportive of Rupert Lowe, against Nigel, having been very favourable towards Nigel Farage, actually turned against Nigel Farage. So that's the first fundamental point, is that there is a schism between the base of the reform support versus where Nigel Farage wants to take the party. The other fundamental point is that Nigel Farage can't play with others. If he was the child in soft play at your local leisure centre, he would be trying to drown the other children in the ball pit. That's what he does. He is a one-man band. And that's And in government, and if you're going to put up an alternative to this government, you need to have, Ian, you need to be able to have a team and work with a team and trust your team. And Nigel Farage doesn't do that. He is the brightest star, and he is the only star within Reform.
And that's just how we both worked with him at the other place. And I remember, his producer at the time, who's now Mike Graham's producer, Christian, it would always be, what Nigel wants to do is what he does.
Yes.
And if he came in with an idea, then his team could have worked all day on something. He would say, I don't want to do that, I'm doing this. And that was how he rolls. And that was part, for many people...
He would listen to opinions, but his role is his point of view is the only point of view.
He's a brand, isn't he?
Yes, he's a brand. And this is also speaks to the other big question mark over this split and what it does, is that actually if you take Nigel Farage out of Reform, and I know there are these question marks about other parties, but actually Reform wouldn't be anywhere. It would, without Nigel Farage. I remember speaking to a really senior Conservative MP now, they've sort of worked their way up the ranks, at a by-election down in Bexley a few years ago, and they were saying to me, look, and this was before Nigel Farage had decided to come back, and he was sort of on the edges, and he was like, I'm not worried about Reform. It's Richard Tice talking about, changing the relationship between the state and British voters. Like, that's not, I don't sweat about it. What I worry about is Nigel Farage coming back properly and starting banging on about small boat crossings. That's what, as a Conservative MP, that's what kept him awake at night. The prospect of Farage coming back. And we saw when Farage, when Reform, just think back to the general election last May, the general election's announced, Farage is like, I'm going to sit this one out, one eye on America. Nobody really thought, it was just, okay, it was a little sideshow. Rishi Sunak was going to do better. And then suddenly Farage goes away, spends the weekend chatting, to friends, colleagues down his pub, and comes back and says he's in the game. He's going to put his hat in the ring. And suddenly everything changes, because suddenly Reform goes, just starts crunching into the Tory.
Do you remember there was that couple of days where Richard Tice was doing all the interviews? He was having to go out.
The Tories were far more relaxed. They were just like, this is okay. Richard Tice does Richard Tice. And that's no disrespect to Richard Tice, okay? He's a perfectly capable politician. But he is not Nigel Farage. And Nigel Farage changes the shape of Reform. Yeah. And I heard James Hill just on before the top of 2 o'clock made the point that, of course, there's just the right becomes quite crowded. If you say, OK, is Ben Habib, former deputy leader, going to go off with Rupert Lowe and create a party, and then you're going to have Reform, and then you're going to have the Conservatives. It's, what we're looking at for the right to be successful in putting up opposition is that there needs to be an amalgamation. The right needs to come together, whether it's a deal between a soft deal or a hard deal between the Conservatives and Reform. It is not more splintering.
Yeah. What's interesting, I think, about this current spat, it has sort of exposed that very point on immigration. Reform can talk about small boats. I've had Richard Tice on many times to literally explain how they believe they can stop those small... And they think there's a plan that you can literally stop those boats, and they believe they're within the law to do it. But that aside, that's only one part of immigration. If the electorate, if the Reform supporters believe that, hang on a second, Nigel Farage, I thought he was the man that wanted to deport 1 million illegal immigrants. He's not that bloke. That's quite a dangerous territory, isn't it?
Well, look, the problem with any deportation plan at the moment, or any plan to deport migrants at the moment, is that who arrive here on small boats, is the European Convention on Human Rights. We've discussed this many times. Every time I come on to discuss this, as somebody who's allowed to stay in this country, you read down the story, and it gets to the 5th or 6th paragraph, and it's Article 8, right to a family life. The judges upheld the right for this particular individual and their family to stay in this country. Nigel Farage would take the UK out of or Britain certainly out of the ECHR. We would no longer be signatories, and therefore when a barrister came to court and said, I want to claim right to a family life under Article 8 of the ECHR, they'd be like, no, not going to happen. Now, what Rupert Lowe is talking about, and the rhetoric Rupert Lowe is talking about, is far more incendiary. He's talking about, in the same language as Donald Trump, in terms of effectively rounding people up and just kicking them out of the country. Now, we can't, the police can't do that at the behest of the courts at the moment, because we are we're at the behest of the ECHR. To do that, Rupert Lowe would need to take us out of the ECHR, but that would need a vote in Parliament to make that happen.
It's interesting Elon Musk hasn't said anything about this yet. I keep looking. I mean, knowing Elon Musk, I mean, it could go the other way, couldn't it? I mean, it could suddenly go, look, I know I said this about Rupert Lowe, but, you know, now I'm thinking get behind Nigel Farage.
Yeah, look, Elon Musk has got his hands full with so many other things at the moment, whether it be Doge or launching space, rockets into space. Yeah. But he's obviously decided to sit this one out. But I think you're right to mention Elon Musk, because if you think back to the turn of the year, it is that switcheroo from the boss of Tesla, where he went from supporting Nigel Farage, and of course there was that photo and talking about as much as $100 million coming into Reform UK's coffers from Mr. Musk via, obviously entities based in this country that would completely change the face of financing in British politics, suddenly to say, actually, because Nigel Farage didn't back Tommy Robinson and wasn't supportive of Tommy Robinson, he was going to put his money or put his support certainly behind Rupert Lowe. That was obviously a real threat to Nigel Farage. You'd see, it was an obvious threat to Nigel Farage, and Rupert Lowe is very well supported amongst the base, but ultimately to the future of Reform. I was having a chat with somebody who's been a staffer at Reform, well, before it was even Reform. I mean, he was working, think all the way back to 2014 in UK, UKIP campaigning for a referendum in Europe to leave the European Union. And they were pointing to me, they were just saying, this is the worst thing in the world for us. What we need to do is we need to get Nigel and Rupert in a boys' club with a steak and a good bottle of claret, and we just need to try and sort this out.
Which goes to the hub of what many people thought about Reform. They didn't call the police. In fact, they routinely attack those stories of people who called the police over a spat. But we'll wait and see the details on that. A little bit of breaking news just come in. Kyle Clifford, he's the man who was found guilty of 3 murders and rape too. 26-year-old Kyle Clifford has been handed 3 whole life orders at his sentencing for those killings of his ex-partner Louise Hunt, her sister Hannah and her mother Carol. Whole life orders mean, of course, he will never ever come out of jail. They're quite rare to be given. This was a particularly brutal and horrific attack. The ex-soldier held at Belmarsh prison refused to appear even by video link, while the judge, Mr. Justice Benathan, declined the option to have him restrained and brought in. But he will never see the light of day again. More on that as it comes in. Theo Ashwood is with us. Keir Starmer warning Labour MPs that unfair welfare bill must be slashed. It's an interesting move, this. We've seen as quite popular with many people, that the Labour Party, of all people, the old socialists, are getting to grips with a ballooning welfare system. Rachel Reeves wants to cut $6 billion off this, and naturally, if you take $6 billion away, then some people are going to be left unhappy with the payments they currently receive.
Yes, and there's a row in Labour. I mean, we're expecting Liz Kendall, the Work and Pensions Secretary, to announce the plans today. That's now being delayed until next week. They're still thrashing out the finer details. The focus of these reforms, Ian, is on incapacity benefit. And the idea is that actually, the numbers are quite stark. If you think back to before the pandemic, incapacity benefit amounted to around £23 billion a year. That's before the pandemic. By 2030, the numbers it's forecast to hit £70 billion. So the focus is on incapacity benefit. But there is this really odd paradox with it, and I did a bit of research on it. And the problem is that actually what's happened to date is the Conservatives cut the benefits when they were designed to help people at the lower end. So they reduced the benefits significantly at the lower end. So if you could do a bit of work, and then you would be eligible to some benefits, but not all. But what that did was and the idea was you save money that way. But what that did actually was make people apply to get the higher end of the benefits.
Higher end, yeah.
So you then get more people that were actually on the lower end, rather than actually seeing their benefits reduced. Were then accessing benefits towards the higher end, and the higher end actually wasn't cut, and that's why the bill is so significant. So the challenge that the Labour government has is to get people off the higher end benefits where they can't work and they have no requirement to go and find work. They need to get them back into the workplace, but that's really difficult to do. And of course, Labour are going to find it. And Keir Starmer's going to find it very difficult to do, given obviously the backdrop of anger within his own party, but what he, they don't want a Labour Prime Minister to act in a cruel way and plunge disabled people and those who are unable to work into poverty. It's not going to be an easy one politically. Within the Labour Party, I know many of your listeners will be very pro cutting benefits and saving the taxpayer cash, but within the Labour Party it's going to go down badly.
It's interesting, on a sort of related point in financial respect, I was talking to somebody who was due to be given compensation for the infected blood scandal, and the offer, you had to sort of apply, they were already in the system, they'd received an interim payment, went through a phone interview, and then got you then get an email saying, we've assessed everything. And her claim should have been something around about £2 million for the absolute horror that she went through. And it came through, she opened up the email and it said 300,000. And they were looking at this thinking, well, that doesn't make any sense. And then they realised, the number crunchers, and the number crunchers, I mean, lawyers who are very good at just changing a word of something perfectly legitimately to reflect a very different way of analysing what was announced by Rishi Sunak, which means that you end up sticking within, literally the government are not breaking any rules. They've just changed slightly the way that people perceive what was past trauma to future trauma to where you are currently. And the smart money says that Labour have looked at this whole multi-billion-pound bill and thought, we can't afford this.
No,
I wouldn't be surprised if that's exactly what happened.
We've got pressure on defence spend. Defence spending has had to go up. Okay, the budget for that has come from international aid. The pressures on the government finance, they want to protect education, they want to protect the NHS. The money needs to come from somewhere, and therefore, because you have all of these protected departments, and of course defence is now very much in that, given the threat Russia continues to pose to Ukraine, and Europe going to have to stump up significantly more money for defence. The departments that have been left, and there are not many of them, we're talking justice, we're talking transport, we're talking communities, which is your local authorities. These are the departments that are going to face the biggest pressures, upwards of 11-12%, perhaps even more. Now, the other option, of course, because Rachel Reeves has been adamant she's not going to change her fiscal rules, the other option, of course, is to increase taxes. But I think given the backlash, there's a recognition within government, given the backlash from what happened in the October budget, there is a recognition in the Treasury that they can't, that Rachel Reeves can't just come back and ask for more cash from taxpayers, because the pressures now on the taxpayers are so significant.
Just very briefly on this, Theo, if we could, the government's planning and infrastructure bill will allow councils to seize land at current value, not its potential hope value, and farmers fear huge financial strain as land for housing, hospitals or schools could be purchased at a fraction of its market worth. 30 seconds if we can, Theo.
This is another kick in the teeth for farmers. So what the government's looking to change with their planning laws to make it easier for councils to build homes is to basically allow councils to issue compulsory purchase orders on farmland, which would basically give them the right to take buy the farmland from the farmer. But of course, farmland where there is no planning permission is worth significantly less than if you have planning permission in place for 3,000 homes, say, because you can sell that land with the planning permission to a developer. They're not taking the risk of whether they get the planning permission or not, because you've got the planning permission, and you can make a really tidy sum. And it should be, if people are going to make a quid, given where we are now with farmers, it should be the farmers. They should be able to sell the land with the planning permission and make the money, if, of course, they're going to face such punitive, punitive change when it comes to inheritance.
Or start growing sunflowers in it or something, so you can keep hold of it as active land. Theo, thank you as ever. Theo Usherwood with us here on Talk 0344 499 1000. If you're done with reform, if you are, and I don't sense most people are who are reform voters, but if you are, how would you vote come an election? Our lines are open. This is Talk.
Yeah, the idea is that, you know, if you're going to be giving these people a lesser sentence on the grounds that they're from Congo, despite the fact that they've committed more violent attacks than anybody else in Britain, that's entirely wrong-headed, isn't it?
Well, this really doesn't seem to me to be a situation which is filled with complexity. If you are a foreign national and you come to the United Kingdom and you commit a crime, then you should be deported.
A lesser sentence on the ground.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
24 minutes after 2 o'clock. So again, that breaking news, 26-year-old Kyle Clifford has been handed 3 whole-life orders for the crossbow and knife murders of his ex-partner Louise Hunt, her sister Hannah and her mother Carol at their home in Bushey on July the 9th last year. Here's the judge, Mr. Justice Joel Benathan.
I therefore make clear at once that for each of these 3 murders, the sentence will be one of life imprisonment with a whole life order. That means a sentence from which you will never be released.
Now, in addition to that, the way, of course, sentencing works, there are other offences. He's also sentenced to a concurrent 20-year sentence for raping his ex-partner, Louise. He gets 1 year for possession of a crossbow, 1 year for possession of a knife, and 8 years for force imprisonment. The judge says he's satisfied Clifford planned and contemplated killing all 3 of his victims. And the ex-soldier, he's been held at Belmarsh Prison, refused to appear even via video link. There was a suggestion he should be brought into court and restrained, but the judge declined that option. He didn't see justice served, but he will now be well aware that he is never, ever coming out of jail. And look, I mean, there is no pecking order of horror, really, when it comes to people brutally taking other people's lives. But I think it would be reasonable to look at this and digest the meticulous way it was planned and the horror with which this man carried this out of 3 innocent women in the safety of their own homes in the most brutal, sadistic and horrendous fashion. I don't think anyone's going to lose any sleep over a man not coming out of jail again. And, of course, it will doubtless, it's futile, I know, but it will doubtless continue that debate about why we don't have the death penalty when we're going to spend, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands or even millions sticking somebody in jail for, what, the next 50 or 60 years until the man dies. 0344 499 1000. Let's go back to your calls. This is Robert in Hertfordshire. Robert, how are you doing?
Hi, Ian.
Hi.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon to you, sir. What are your thoughts?
Just to let you know that I was a fully paid up member of Reform.
Okay.
I used to get Christmas cards from Nigel. Yeah. I used to get an invitation to the Christmas do, and I used to be invited to stand as a councillor.
Okay.
I chucked my membership card in yesterday in disgust.
Wow.
It's not the party that I want to be associated with. The trouble with Nigel Farage is he talks the talk, but he don't walk the walk. And they're just behaving like, well, they're behaving like the Tories. There's no difference in them at all.
Do you... yeah, I mean, that's the interesting bit, isn't it? Because they were the very antitheses of the Tories. They were doing what Tories should be doing, tough on immigration, all the woke stuff, people who called the police over a silly argument. They were the people that stood up and reflected that view, that outrage sometimes. And yet we find ourselves in a position where, you know, that appears to be compromised now. I mean, it might not be, and, it could still turn good for Reform, but you feel strongly enough, Robert, that this is a turning point.
Well, let me ask you something. Apart from sending the migrants home, what is their manifesto? You can't tell me because I don't know what it is. What is their manifesto?
You mean on health and education and defence and all those kind of... It's a great point. I mean, in fairness, it happens to all sorts of... I couldn't really name a Tory policy at the moment because they don't really need to announce one. But when you're reform, I think it's becoming more and more urgent. And I'm sure if Richard Tice was here now, he would say, no, if you bother to look, all the details are there. But I think they have an urgency to be big on all the big subjects. I don't know what they stand for on education. I don't know what they really stand for on health, to be honest.
Well, I think he's a snake oil salesman. I always have thought that. I've never really trusted him, to be honest with you. And I think the Reform Party as an ideal is good, but they deserve someone better than him.
So who would you vote for then if there was an election, Robert? Would you go back to the Tories?
More right wing, to be honest with you.
I don't know how...
Well, you know what I think the row was about? I think the row was about Tommy Robinson. I really do believe that, because Nigel Farage was absolutely terrified. But you know what turned it for me, Ian? And I'll tell you, I heard rumblings last week, long before this blew, that Nigel Farage was sanctioning the return of Shamina Begum to this country. Can you confirm this story?
I don't think he had any legal power to sanction.
No, he don't have to have legal power. Just his opinions.
Oh, his opinion. Well, yeah. I mean, so he wasn't sanctioning as such. I think he made the point that
sorry,
she.
I used the wrong.
Yeah,
term.
no, that's all right. I think he was saying that she should come back, wasn't he? That was the last comment he made on it.
That's disgusting. Even if this wouldn't have been brought up, that would have been enough for me. Number one, she's not a British subject anymore.
Yep.
She is a terrorist sympathiser. See, we will never get anywhere while we keep doing this. What's your views?
Well, I don't know whether it's going to change the fate of reform. I think that's the difference to me from what you said, Robert, because whilst I get everything you said, when push comes to shove and people walk into that polling station and they see Tories, Lib Dem, Labour, Green, Reform, they're still going to vote Reform, aren't they? Well, and you probably would as well, Robert.
I'll join Reform because I just wanted to cheer myself up. Now, people voted Labour because they were sick of the Conservatives. What it seems to be is people were voting for a party for the wrong reasons. You know, it seems to be...
Well, you're right. I mean, I always say, you have to do a little bit of research into parties. You've got to have an idea you've got to put some meat on the bone of your opinions, because looking at headlines and looking at social media and just basing it on, a couple of little videos or memes that have been put out is never going to get you anywhere. You've got to read stuff, and you've got to read more than one version of stuff. You've got to know the difference between, what one member says to what another member says. I mean, a lot of this stuff was out there already, right? I mean, you'd spotted it, Robert.
Can I ask you something? I'm the guy who gave you a demonstration with the 2 coins with
I remember the 2 coins, yeah.
How easy it is to become right-wing without even moving. Can I ask you something? I want you to answer. If I put a George cross in my garden this afternoon,
yeah,
and 100 people walk past, how many people do you think, including yourself, would assume that I was right wing?
A St George's cross.
St George's cross. What did I say?
So, no, when you said a George cross, I thought you meant the medal.
No,
that's all right. Okay, a St George's cross in your garden.
Red cross.
I certainly wouldn't think that made you right wing, as in an insult right wing. I would assume that if somebody said, "What party do you think this guy votes for?" I would assume it's a party that enthuses patriotism.
Yeah, but it seems like it's become, if you're patriotic in this country, it seems that you're right wing.
Well, we all remember Rochester, right,
America,
Robert?
There's stars and stripes in every garden in America.
Yeah, they're all over the place. I went past a house the other day that had a St George's flag and a Ukrainian flag, and then halfway down the road, this was in a lovely sleepy village in Kent, I saw a Welsh flag on the side of the house. So there was a real flag variant going on in Hawkhurst at the weekend. Robert, thank you very much indeed for that. 0344 499 1000. People crave it's common sense, all right? It's that simple. We are talking the common sense agenda. I don't know if any political party is capable of delivering all of it. Nigel Farage's comments on Rupert Lowe saying, I would deport a million illegal immigrants. Farage's point is, it's a nice idea, but it can't be done. Because come the election, if he says it can be done, and he found himself in number 10, if he found himself in number 10, he'd have to then go, oh, it can't be done. Donald Trump said it can be done, and made a big fanfare in the first couple of weeks of deportations and lots of TV cameras around watching it all unfold. That's gone a little quiet now. Have you noticed that? 0344 499 1000. Back with more from you in a couple of moments' time. This is Talk.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
She says, personally, I think the party system is what is ruining British politics, with barely a fag paper between the parties and what they say they will do if elected. We have no real choice and therefore no real democracy. If you were Keir Starmer or Kemi Badenoch sitting here, they'd go, no, 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 we're nothing like each other. Not at all. And then Ed Davey, remember dear old Ed, still running the Lib Dems, they've got a few MPs over there. We forget that, 70-odd MPs. At the heels of the Tories, you might say. What is the real difference? What difference do we need? People thought that was in reform. Now, some of you, certainly the ones getting in touch, our last caller articulated that very point, sensing that actually it isn't that different over there at Reform from the Conservatives. I think that I could reasonably argue there is quite a lot of difference still, despite what has happened. It's just gone 25 to 3. Now, talks are underway in Saudi Arabia between Ukraine and American officials about a deal to end the war with Russia. This is just hours after Kyiv carried out what they're calling their biggest drone strike on Moscow, 3 people dead. It's understood Ukraine will propose a limited ceasefire with the Kremlin's previously, the Kremlin previously said it wants to keep territory. Let's speak to Peter Conradi, Europe editor over there at the Sunday Times, also author of Who Lost Russia. Peter, good afternoon to you. Nice to have you with us. I mean, look, I don't think any of us sit with much enthusiasm or confidence when these talks happen. You know, if something good comes or positive of this, then great. Just give us an idea of the significance, firstly, of this meeting between Ukrainian and American officials.
Yeah, I mean, we've had a lot of meetings in the past couple of weeks, 3 weeks or so. This one is significant because it's the first time really that the Ukrainians have sat down behind closed doors with the Americans to negotiate. I mean, all we've had so far in terms of contact between the Ukrainians and the Americans was this really ill-fated visit by President Zelensky to the White House, where he got essentially thrown out by Donald Trump almost a couple of weeks ago. So they're sitting down, they're negotiating in Jeddah, in Saudi Arabia, neutral territory, looking at what would be acceptable to the Ukrainians. But of course, this is only part of the picture, because it's not America at war with Ukraine, it's Russia that's at war with Ukraine. And so the idea basically is that I think the Americans will get an idea of what the Ukrainians would accept, and then the Americans will then go to the Russians, because the Russians will talk only to the Americans, and they will try and stitch together some kind of a deal.
As you say, this is one of many talks that has happened, the significance being it is, the Americans sitting down with the Ukrainians. Of course, the smart money in all of this, Peter, would say concessions will be mentioned on more than one occasion. That's clearly a bit of a sticking point for Ukraine. They don't want to cede anything here, but again, the smart money says they're probably going to have to.
Oh, yeah, I mean, they certainly are. I mean, I think, as long as Joe Biden was president and as long as was continuing to fund the Ukrainian war effort, then there was still hope that the Ukrainians could push the Russians back to some extent, although realistically they could never have pushed them out completely. What is clear now is that what we're edging towards is a deal whereby the Russians effectively will keep what they've got so far, which is about 20% of the country, including Crimea, including much of the east of Ukraine proper, and the Ukrainians are just going to have to accept it. So, that's the way things are going, and the Trump administration is so keen to get that kind of a deal. They've been playing hardball with the Ukrainians. It's not just throwing Zelensky out of the White House. It's much more serious than that in terms of holding back intelligence information, holding back military supplies to the Ukrainians, which is basically the Americans strong-arming them and saying, look, you've got to accept that this is the best deal you're going to get, and if you don't, we're taking all this stuff away from you, and you can see quite how bad it's going to get for you. I mean, it's sort of classic strong arm, one might even say kind of Godfather style tactics, but what alternative have the Ukrainians got effectively?
Do Russia come away from this happy, do you sense, Peter? I mean, if they get some land, some of the regions, many which they would argue already theirs, that would be the Putin argument, of course, but they don't get everything. Is it enough for Putin to be satisfied, do you sense? And are America quite relaxed about the idea that they are seen as almost siding with Russia on this?
Yeah, I mean, interesting question. I mean, until now, it's the Ukrainians that appear to have been making all the concessions. I mean, the Americans have certainly not demanded that the Russians do anything at all or give up anything at all. I mean, I think the Russians have long since accepted they weren't going to take the whole of Ukraine. They're making progress, but there's no way they're going to get Kiev. There's no way they're going to get the west of the country. And the noises coming out of Moscow are still pretty aggressive. I mean, Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, sort of poured scorn on this idea of having Western peacekeepers, the idea that Keir Starmer has been pushing towards together with Emmanuel Macron and so on. I mean, the Russians are, to get an idea of the hard line. I mean, I just saw a quote from Lavrov, who was speaking in Moscow, and he said, what will the peacekeepers protect? The remnants of the Kiev Nazi regime? I mean, that's the way that the Russians still see it. Yeah. And, Trump is not demanding anything from them yet. I mean, it'll be quite intriguing to see what will happen when finally the Americans talk to the Russians, but they're essentially delivering the Ukrainians to them.
Is this just about Mr. Trump saying, I solved it, there is now peace, there's no longer a war, the killing has finished? Or is there a wider game going on here? Because the usual order of events, Peter, as you know more than most, is that, America don't really get into bed with Russia. Even in the good times, they don't do that. There's always that distance. And, if you follow the sort of Churchillian model, there would be none of this going on. And the sense that there's appeasement happening here is not something many leaders in the West are particularly happy with. But is it about more than just creating a lasting peace? Is Trump playing a longer game here?
Yeah, I think he is. I mean, there is no doubt that he wants to sort of solve this war. He wants to bring an end to this war. I mean, partly why? Well, because he said he was going to do it in the run up to the election. He said he was going to solve it in, I can't remember, a week, 2 weeks, whatever. I mean, he clearly hasn't. But he's sort of, for him, it's sort of a matter of pride to solve it. It's almost like he's kind of a checklist of the world's trouble spots. So Gaza, tick. Doing that. Ukraine wants to tick that. More broadly, I think we're looking at a very, very dramatic change in the whole nature of international relations. Until now, we've had a solid, since the Second World War, it's been America plus Europe against the Russians. Now, that's not at all sure. It's Trump keeps, have you ever heard Trump saying a negative word about Putin?
Yeah.
No. He's got his golfing buddy, Steve Witkoff, who is formally speaking the Middle East envoy, but he's also seems to be handling Russia. Witkoff met Putin last month and came away saying they're friends. Yeah. So, this is a new world order that is emerging with Russia on one side, and China and America, and the Americans trying, in a sense, to do what's said to be a kind of a reverse Nixon. Nixon went to do a deal with the Chinese so they could both gang up on the Russians. It looks like maybe Trump is trying to do a reverse Nixon, trying to gang up with the Russians on the Chinese.
Maybe it could be as simple as that. Often these things are more simple than perhaps we might imagine. Listen, Peter, great to talk to you. Thank you. Peter Conradi, Europe editor over there at the Sunday Times, also author of Who Lost Russia. Wouldn't that be an interesting scenario? Get the Russians on side against the Chinese. Would that be enough, though? I mean, the Chinese have been very generous to Russia, not just over this, in lots of other areas as well. Sticking with Donald Trump, by the way, Donald Trump has said he will double his planned tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum from 25 to 50%. He said the increase in the tariff set to take effect tomorrow as the trade war between the two countries intensified. Look, the word, have you ever noticed every now and again, people who've never used a certain word find themselves using it all the time without knowing much about it. I reckon most people have never uttered the word tariff in a conversation or a sentence in their life. Now everyone's, you've got to put the tariffs on. Oh, stick the tariffs on. Trump, he's doing good, isn't he, with the tariffs? He loves a tariff, does our Donald. The smart money at the moment is saying this is not going particularly well for the United States. Now, you could counter that and say, well, actually, it's early days. The economy's taken a bit of a tumble. Donald Trump did acknowledge that. There's some bumps in the road, but this will come good for America. But certainly the stock markets haven't reacted. The financial and the money markets haven't reacted very well to what's going on. Trump is doubling down again. He's a clever man. Is there a wider game? He's a clever man. He's not that clever, by the way. He's not Pythagoras, for God's sake. He's not God. But he's an operator. We know how he runs businesses. We know he plays a longer game. He's done that with Ukraine, and much of what he's done with Ukraine needed to happen. But on the tariff thing, I wish I knew more about it so I could sit here and give you a nice 60-second monologue as to why this is the best thing in the world or the absolute worst thing in the world. I can't. Maybe you can. 0344 499 1000. All I know is the money markets have not reacted very well to this so far. Is that likely to turn a corner and be a huge positive for the USA? Our lines are open. This is Talk.
Yeah, the idea is that, you know, if you're going to be giving these people a lesser sentence on the grounds that they're from Congo, despite the fact that they've committed more violent attacks than anybody else in Britain, that's entirely wrong-headed, isn't it?
Well, this really doesn't seem to me to be a situation which is filled with complexity. If you are a foreign national and you come to the United Kingdom and you commit a crime, then you should be deported.
A lesser sentence on the ground.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Just bit 10 to 3, by the way, just before we go back to the phones. It's day 3 of The Voice of Doom. This is the mystery voice with a political angle, of course. No one's got it so far. Day 3, here's the voice.
What would you have done?
Who is... I've forgotten who it is again. Oh, yes, now I remember. Here it is again.
What would you have done?
Remember, don't call in because there ain't no prize on this, but you can message in if you fancy having a crack at this. 87222 if you think you know whose voice that is. If we get a right answer, we will reveal all after the 3 o'clock news. If we don't, it rolls over till tomorrow. Here it is again.
What would you have done?
Thoughts on that? 87222. Back to your comments. This is Georgina down in London. Georgina, what have you got for us?
Well, I mean, as far as another political party is concerned, if I wasn't voting or being a member of Reform UK, then it would have to be the talkTV political party, because that's an absolute winner for me.
Do you know what? Yeah, that's what we need to do. We need to start a political party. Maybe we'll do okay.
You'd have my vote, darling, every time.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, that's...
I'm going to have a bit of a rant now at Nigel Farage. I'm
you
really
rant
angry.
away.
Right, OK. This is turned into get your wagons in a circle. It's an ambush. They need to grow up and get on with the job in hand. That is what they are there for. This is not about them, Ian. It's about having a serious alternative political party to get this country back on track. This country is so desperate now for change. We'd vote for a horse in a hoop skirt if the policies were right. Anything but Conservative or Labour. All we're hearing is petty squabbling and character assassinations. This is not acceptable. Nigel has got to be a team player, and he needs a Herculean team around him. You can't function in a toxic environment, so this toxicity has got to stop. No matter how good of a seasoned politician Nigel is, he can't be a one-man army. There's too much testicular fortitude going on between Rupert and Nigel in Reform. It was never going to work. It was a volatile situation from the off. They need some strong women in their team to keep them in check. Seriously. I think that this detain and deport policy was a key factor in the members that have gone with Reform. That's what I say, and Nigel needs to think strong and
Yeah,
hard.
you see, there is a sense, isn't there, that whether... I mean, Nigel would probably say, look, I never said out loud I'm going to suddenly deport 1 million people. But I think there was definitely a reasonable expectation that that was where he was.
Well, listening to Rupert, you see, with Rupert, it was detain, deport. This is music to the people of the UK. We don't want them here. We don't want them. It's got to a stage now where women can't even go out and be safe. It's a problem. When Rupert said detain, deport, that was music to our ears. That would help the economic structure of this country as well, because we are spending billions that we haven't got. We can't do this anymore.
And we're spending it by the hour as well. Listen, Georgina, I have to cut in for no other reason than time, but thank you for that. This comes from Lenny, who says, I believe so. Predicted last year. Some of the boats are organised and controlled by Iran. Starmer saying he will smash the boats is just scamming lies and tricky doing nothing. Name one positive action Starmer has done. I can't find any. That's a fair point. Angela says, I'm not leaving Reform as I could not vote Tory, Labour or Liberal. and any other right-wing parties, they're no hopers. Old and Grumpy says, come on Ian, Reform are pretty much an irrelevant protest party. Stop spending so much time on them and focus on the utter shambles that is Labour, who are currently getting a free pass. I do get the last point. Currently in the polls, Reform are beating the official opposition. And in some cases, they're beating the government. Now, ordinarily, that might not mean very much, but when you're a party with only 5 MPs and you've only been formed for about 5 minutes, the significance of that is huge. And these are big players, because whilst they may only be 5 of them, they are informing and in some cases commanding and initiating the debate. We wouldn't be talking about immigration at the levels we do. In fact, if Farage and co were not around, Labour would be getting a free pass on all of this stuff. There would be none of it. So I think there's every reason to talk about this in terms of our democracy. What would have to happen? I don't know, if Reform kind of disbanded, or, you know, another issue happened that made them smaller or less relevant to some people. Could the Tories ever step up and hoover up that space? Because a lot of that space isn't an area where the Tories have gone near for 14, 15, 16 years. They're not robust on immigration. We know that. And the Rwanda plan was a bit half-baked. It might have worked a bit. I don't think it would have been a seismic game changer. Let's get a voice note on Reform from Ian.
Nigel Farage has gone down an awful lot in my estimations. I think this is ego-driven. That said, in terms of how Reform are going to be viewed by the electorate, I think we need to look at how Labour got in last time. It was anyone but the Tories. Now, Reform have raised a high enough profile that everybody knows about them now, and they are anyone but the Tories and Labour. So I think this will still hold good for them.
It'll still hold good, Ian. Thank you very much for that. Paul in Dorset, though, says, I will vote for Reform as soon as Nigel Farage steps down. I feel for the 4 million voters who wanted change and discovered a despot. Others are coming in with a very different view, that Nigel Farage is still central and the only man able to get these narratives on the agenda. Let's talk to Nigel in Peebles. How you doing, Nigel?
I'm fine, thank you.
Good. What are your
very
thoughts?
Interesting. Now, I've been listening to all of this through the last few days. Nigel has failed to lead. That is the problem. He's been controlled, as I see it, by his chairman. He's gone soft on things like Shamima Begum in the last few weeks, saying she'll face the full justice of British law if she comes back here. Well, she wouldn't, because that's only reserved for Facebook posts. He's lost what the party wants him to do. I think the person that needs to go is Zia Youssef. I think all of these problems have come since he took over as chairman. You can't afford to lose people like Ben Habib and Rupert Lowe. They are, both of them, far better than any politician the Tories have got. And I think it's a failure of leadership by Nigel and a failure of control by Nigel. It's not insurmountable if he recognises it and pulls back. But he needs to do that. And with it now all out in the open, as I said yesterday, I think they should hold a live YouTube event, get everything out in the open,
well,
should they see what's what.
Or should they put it to the members as to who should be the leader? Because there's no way... I mean, Rupert Lowe is not coming back, right, to Reform.
He might. He's big enough, I'm sure. If it was... If they
I'm
were
not so sure.
I don't know, but if they were all behind a table, and this KC they've put in place questions all of them, and they all get it out, and I think at the end of it, the members should vote. Should Zia Youssef stay? Should Nigel Farage remain leader? Should Rupert Lowe be reinstated?
It's a good point. It's members that make up the party. Nigel, thank you very much for that passionate stuff. Dave in Waltham says, I've been listening for days about this reform issue. As far as I know, I've heard nothing but speculation from many people who are from other political parties and the public. There hasn't been so far anything from Reform except Rupert Lowe and Ben Habib, but nothing in reply from anybody at Reform. Maybe you should stop much of the speculation until there has been a full investigation from the police, and perhaps some information from Nigel already. Well, there has been statements from Nigel. He made a statement again, not for the first time, just last night. As for people dropping their membership, maybe they should think about why they've joined rather than making a decision on speculative comments. Well, some of it is speculative and some of it isn't. There are certain facts that are already out there. The immigration divide is one of them. Dave goes on to say, personally, I would like to say if there's been issues between Robert and Nigel then prior to the last week or so, then I can say it's reflective of every other political party. I think he means Rupert. Get the point. Here's the voice of doom reminder.
What would you have done?
Who is that? If you think you know, 87222, maybe we'll have an answer. We'll tell you on the other side of the news at 3.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Welcome back. 3 minutes after 3 o'clock. Lots to get through in this section. Reform UK civil war rages on. We now know the old bill launching an investigation into allegations of, quote, a series of verbal threats, unquote, allegedly made by the suspended MP Rupert Lowe. Mr. Lowe denies any wrongdoing. He has instructed his lawyers to respond accordingly. Also this afternoon, triple killer Kyle Clifford has been handed 3 whole life orders for the crossbow and knife murders of his ex-partner Louise, her sister and mother at their home in Hertfordshire last year. We'll bring you the latest on that. And there are fears a Palestinian migrant who filmed himself crossing the Channel, the man who has called for God to kill all Jews, could remain in Britain due to, yes, human rights laws. We'll have more on that too. Everything you need to know, all the breaking news right here on Talk. 0344 499 1000 is where you'll find us. Before we go any further, we are going to talk in a moment about that curious story of the gun-toting boat migrant. Let's first get to the voice of doom. This was day 3 of the voice of doom. Has somebody gone and guessed it? This is the voice.
What would you have done?
Who's that? Alan Sugar, no. Jake Berry, no. Jeremy Corbyn, no. Mark Francois, it is not. David Cameron, it is not. These are just a few of the wrong guesses. However, we have got a winner. And that is no prize, by the way, just the accolade and the kudos of saying you got it. James in Worksop correctly guessed the answer. Let's hear the voice again, Amy.
What would you have done?
Is Chris Patten. He, of course, was a former Conservative MP. He was chairman of the Conservative Party. He was the last governor of Hong Kong. I'd forgotten that. He was also a European Commissioner after that. The last governor of Hong Kong, and for many, many years, he was an MP for the Tory party for Bath. So he was right in there, and when he got kicked out of office, they rewarded him with one of the best jobs in global politics, which was the governor of Hong Kong. It's like the king role. Amazing gig. Chris Patten was the right answer. Well done to James and others who were shouting at their radios and TVs going, I know who that is. He was the first one with the right answer. So let's move to this story then. Curious times, and yet it's sort of chapter 7,000 of weird suggestions from our legal system. Britain could be forced to keep the gun-toting Channel boat migrant who called God to kill all Jews due to human rights laws. This is a fella who's described himself as Palestinian, Abu Wadi, arrested days after he filmed himself crossing from France in a dinghy. He remains in custody. Quite why he would have filmed himself. This guy has a social media presence of some sort. The Home Office rules bar deportation to Gaza. It's a war-torn place, and therefore their own rules say we can't send him back there. This sparked fears, understandably so, that he might be allowed to stay. In fact, he will almost certainly be allowed to stay. I don't think there's any other options now. We don't have a Rwanda scheme, remember that. Let's speak with Stephen Wolfe, former MEP, Director at the Centre for Migration and Economic Prosperity. Stephen, good afternoon to you. I said there at the beginning it's chapter 7,000 of weird decisions that might happen. It's probably chapter 170,000, frankly. We've seen all of this before.
We have. We probably see a different story every time we have someone cross the boats. There's a story per channel migrant, isn't there?
Seems to be.
And unfortunately, we have that situation once again where this man is pretty evil, by the way, from the statements that he's made. I don't think anybody would say that killing Jews and wiping out the Israeli nation is a nice and kind and warm and cuddly thing that you'd want someone to say in your country. But if we do get to this situation, Ian, where they are claiming the European Courts for Human Rights, Article 8, we should throw back at them the very simple provisions that it states that you can remove somebody if they are a threat to national security, a threat to public safety, a threat to the economy, a threat to the health and morals of the nation, or indeed a threat to create further disorder and crime. And I would say all of them apply to this particular individual.
Yeah. So you could still go the Gaza route if you really could prove all of that?
I would suggest you could. The argument that would be placed in front of the court is that by sending him back to Gaza, that is breaching his human rights because perhaps there is nowhere to live, or he would be in danger of being shot by the IDF. But I don't think that's really a valid argument when you've got somebody who's made these claims, as he has done himself stupidly on TikTok. So I think that would have to be a far greater priority to say that he's a threat to the security of this nation. And if it's not Gaza, then maybe we can send him to the West Bank.
Yeah. And it seems to me, maybe this is a little conspiratorial, I wonder, did this guy orchestrate all of this? I mean, this is a bloke that already had a social, I wouldn't say he was a household name, I mean, hardly Anton Deck, but, you know, he's a guy that was, you know, quite happy to have his profile all over social media, tens of thousands of followers on TikTok and elsewhere, and then goes on somehow, curiously, of all the people that end up on the French coast to come to the UK, he's one of them, almost like he's documenting this for some reason, and then films himself on the boat as well, and that gets posted too. He had time somehow to film it and post. So it's all a bit curious in that respect, possibly banking on the idea that he'll be in the UK for half an hour before he's processed, and when he's processed, the human rights lawyers, they'll pop up and they'll plead his case, and he'll either stay here or voluntarily leave.
Well, it is curious, but he's not the first to have actually filmed himself coming across the boats.
Sure.
We know and watched many of them, but he's also not the first to actually put it on TikTok and try to make fame out of this. Do you remember the couple who came across the boats about a year and a half ago? The two of them were filming themselves, a young man and a young woman, and they were saying what a great journey that they had, and they were having a lot of fun on the boat doing so. And I think they were making fun of us. They were making fun of our immigration system.
Yep.
And this individual was probably recognizing that he would probably get a lot more hits, some big followers. And when he arrives here, if he was able to successfully argue that he could stay, this is a clarion call to everybody else across the globe who wants to come across the channel and saying, even if I can do it with all the statements that I've made and the fact that I filmed myself can stay here, you can too.
Well, anybody who's threatening mass murder or terrorism, whatever word you want to use, if they can stay, then like you say, anybody can stay, surely. I mean, he's the bullseye in terms of people you don't want here.
Absolutely, and that's why it's making us a laughing stock. And it's very clear now that what I've been arguing for a long time, and I've heard some Labour MPs recently on panels that I've been on involved in, we need to reform the UN conventions on refugees to recognise the new millennia, the way that people are just coming across to economic reasons, not really fleeing torture. We need to change the European Court of Human Rights, and in our case, leave the ECHR, leave the Human Rights Act, and translate the new changes to remove the provisions in our common law that allow these individuals to stay. Only then will we get to a proper system that allows genuine refugees to be allowed to stay here.
Spot on. Stephen, as ever, thank you. Stephen Wolfe, former MEP, now director at the Centre for Migration and Economic Prosperity. Is there anybody, even a sort of an ardent lefty, that would go, yeah, I think this guy should stay? I mean, really, it does expose the porous nature of our entire system. And nobody, you know, when we talk about the Human Rights Act, I see many seasoned politicians, even those supposedly on the right of politics, argue very passionately, almost on occasions tearfully, that we should never leave the ECHR. We should never leave. Now, let's say there are other good reasons. I'm not a qualified lawyer. My brain has not, to declare my lack of knowledge on this, my brain is not across every dot and cross and detail of the Human Rights Act. So there might be some stuff in there that I'm not familiar with, and if I was familiar with, I would go, right, okay. So it does look a bit iffy when I read some of the stories, but actually some really good reasons why we've got it there still. Because I keep hearing people go, you never know when you might need it. That seems to be the line. You never know when you might need it. All right, so that's apparently the case. I'm not aware, by the way, of any persuasive arguments that have made a case, but I'm aware of many persuasive arguments that have made a case to get rid of it. So if it's wrong, then somebody tell us to get rid of it. Tell us specifically why it's wrong, rather than kind of leaning on sort of, well, it was written by Winston Churchill. It was 5 billion years ago. This happened for an entirely different time, for entirely different reasons. There's no one with a straight face could say, yeah, this is exactly what they had in mind when they carved out this human rights thing, that it would stop a Jew-hating man threatening to kill, murder, terrorise, whatever word you want to use, people of a certain faith, that it was designed to protect those people for when they decide to randomly arrive in another country uninvited. They should be allowed to stay because we have a law designed for this. Nobody, absolutely no, even the left-wing lawyers. Look, the left-wing lawyers, fair play to these boys. They're trousering the cash on this one. It's their job. They're interpreting the law as it stands. But that cannot, by any intellectual measure, be the purpose of that law. There's no one with a straight face. You've got Jeremy Corbyn in a room and gave him a few ales and a bag of peanuts and said, come on, Chezza, do you really believe this is what the human... Really? I think you'd even get him on your side. So something's got to change. So if you're not going to scrap it, I mean, it has to be amended. It has to be amended because we can't keep seeing these stories. And the line we hear constantly is these stories don't represent most of what the ECHR is about, so don't judge it on these stories. Well, I'm failing to see what it is about. I'm failing to see the myriad of examples that are apparently out there that would convince you and me that actually there's a very, very good reason why this law is in place. Don't be put off by chicken nuggets and matey who doesn't like Jews. Don't use that to define what the law... No, it's about much more than that. Well, what is it then? What is the much more bit? Because I ain't hearing it from anybody. This comes from Penny, who says, I joined Reform UK recently so that I could attend the Cornwall conference. I came away feeling inspired by all of the speakers, not just Nigel Farage. He is, of course, the consummate campaigner, passionate and charismatic, and appears totally dedicated to his vision of a fairer Britain for all of us. But the other speakers are just as committed to this vision. I firmly believe that despite the appalling public display of this divide between Nigel and Rupert, Reform is still the only viable alternative to Labour and the Conservative stranglehold. Its members must stand firm in the conviction of what the party stands for and not lose sight of the disastrous alternative, a Labour-Tory combined majority, or horror of horrors, Labour in power for yet another term. I will still vote Reform regardless, because I want this country to change for the better rather than failing its people as it is now. And the grim... Thank you, Penny, for that very passionate message that you sent over an hour ago now, but I'm happy to get it in there and read it. The reality is, if there was a general election tomorrow, the Labour Party would still walk it. Just let that settle. Back to your calls. David in Exeter. What have you got for us, David? Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Ian. Just picking up on a wonderful cue there from Stephen Wolfe, conversation on national security. So what I want to highlight for everyone at the moment is this, and that is the current National Security Advisor, Jonathan Powell, who used to be Tony Blair's 2IC.
Yep.
All right, so he's currently the principal load officer for this. So, you know, that's where what I'm submitting is where the power lays. It does not lay with the ministers anymore. They're just a facade. It doesn't lay with Parliament, as we're very well highlighted by Rupert Lowe yesterday with Dan Wharton. And he's starting to realise this, that the ministers are just a facade. And as we've heard from Dominic Cummings, the cabinet is scripted. The ministers can just say yes. They're merely just puppets. So the power is laying with the top board civil servants, and that is why our governance system is broken. We're no longer sharing power. You can vote for who you want at the minute. Forget that. Jonathan Powell is refusing to go before Parliamentary Scrutiny Committee to be questioned. Now, let's just let that sink in. So you want to talk about the migrant chap or border security or the war in Ukraine or Chagos, or our current military status, or our ammunition stocks, or matters of what you consider national security, that civil servant is refusing to go before Parliamentary Committee. Now, Lisa Kearns has highlighted this, and it's also up on Politics Home. All right, they've highlighted it. So I just want people to realise this, that really at the moment we're being governed by, as Rupert pointed out, and he is correct from my understanding, from the circle of high-ranking military officers and defence advisors that I liaise with on defence and security issues, that we're being governed really by 23 permanent secretaries, and that's where the power is laying. We're no longer governed by a cabinet and the elected Democrats.
Yeah, I hear this. I do hear this said increasingly that there was, a time when the permanent secretaries would be responsible to ministers, and now we've got that not just recently under Labour, but under the last couple of decades, we've had that reversed.
It's reversed. The power. My understanding is, now I'm submitting this as a question, Ian, because further and better particulars have got to be brought forth because exactly what's going on here. My understanding is that Tony Blair flipped the power from the ministers to the civil servants, and then set up effectively what would be, a socialist sort of operating system in the cabinet office. So the civil servants lay the Crown side of what's supposed to be the power-sharing arrangement. So we've got the Democratic bit, the MPs we elect, and then we've got the Crown side, and then we've got the Lords. Now, it's supposed to be shared between the three of them, so we get stuff done, and it's coherent. But at the moment, what we've got, the Democratic bit, I think you and everybody else would agree, isn't working. And the ministers aren't working because none of them, and Rupert highlighted this yesterday very well, which is what expertise and experience have they got? Now, let's go one click further. Let's look at the permanent secretaries. What expertise and experience have they got? Because you can't run a government which is effectively really in Whitehall now. It's a regional administrative unit of the EU. We don't have directors.
Despite leaving the EU.
Yeah, what we've got is managers. So Blair set the thing up, I understand, as a regional administrative unit like he wanted for the rest of the regions of Britain. So the policy would come in from the EU. We don't need directors. We don't need a government because it's going to be done from Brussels. A principal point, let's just get back to this. This is, the focus of the attention and the questioning must go on to people like Jonathan Powell personally. A few of us did this with the Veterans Lawfare case with Dennis Hutchins, and I was helped very well by a lot of SAS veterans who are also being hounded under the lawfare now from what they did in Northern Ireland, and it'll be Afghanistan. We put the focus on Stephen Lovegrove, who was the permanent secretary at the MOD. So he's the principal load officer for the MOD, and he then became National Security Advisor. And what we found was, as soon as we started to challenge him, they just moved. Right? But this is, and I think if anybody wanted to wind the clip back when Johnny Mercer challenged him at committee about the IHAT scandal for the Iraq veterans, which was as soon as the Iraq veterans sort of IHAT scandal with Shiner was exposed, Lovegrove was at committee and went, it was shut down at an appropriate time. And they were like, hang on a minute, just a second, you've ruined all these guys' lives that you've asked to go and put their neck on the line to fight for us. So I think this is what we've got to look at. Let's make a campaign out of this. Right, Jonathan Powell, you need to get to committee and explain yourself.
I always thought it was quite hard to refuse a committee invite, but maybe they've loosened the rules on that one as well. Listen, David, I have to move, but thank you. Very thorough stuff. David in Exeter, where does the real power lie? More from you on the way. 0344 499 1000. We're asking that question. If you're done with reform, who would you vote for? There's a big old by-election looming over in Runcorn Way in the next couple of months. So if that were to be the case, Reform came second there last time, the Tories third. It was very close between Tories and Reform, but Reform came second. The Labour vote is going to go down. I'd be surprised if it went up. Is that the shoe-in for Reform to collar another MP at a time when they really need it? Not only would it mean their numbers are back to where they were, but it would also be a great story for Reform to say, look, we're back in business. Like, that was a blip. It doesn't matter. People still love us. 0344 499 1000.
I'm more of the view that actually there were political tensions between the two men. They had a different view about where the party should go. Rupert Lowe, I think, was becoming quite impatient about some of the points that he was making. And Nigel Farage decided this was not a tension that he would tolerate. And I think these allegations of misbehaviour were more of a cover for something that he wanted to do anyway.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Carl says, reference the migrant who's been arrested but probably won't get deported. This guy's got a mobile phone and a TikTok account, and he's a refugee? Really? Come on, man. It's a very good point, isn't it? You can't imagine many people escaping tyranny in the Second World War, trying to, realising what was going on and thinking we've got to get the hell out of here. But before I do, I'm just going to check my Facebook. I mean, I don't imagine that a case such as that would really come under the sort of banner of desperate refugee. One here, human rights are essential. However, the rights of the many must trump the rights of an individual. Good point. Carl in Derbyshire, come on, folks. We all know reform is merely a conduit for getting Nigel closer to the big job. Leader of the Conservative Party. When he goes into coalition with the Tories, he'll collapse the Reform Party like a deck chair. I think, although he will never concede to a deal with the Tories, if he were to be the dominant opposition, I don't dispute that reverting to the name Conservative would be his thing. He's been a lifelong Conservative, remember, and only escaped it because of what he felt were the shortcomings and the ineptitude of their kind of philosophical core. But yeah, I sense you're probably right, Carl. Back to your calls. Ben is over here in Essex. What are you thinking, Ben? Good afternoon.
Yeah, hi Ian. So it's my first time calling. Well, it's not my first time calling to the actual channel, but my first time for you. Spoke to cohorts in the past.
Nice to have you with us, Ben.
Yeah, thank you, sir. I'm a fully paid up member of Reform Party, and I believe I could have my facts slightly wrong here, but I believe back in September when they announced that the Reform Party were going to make changes, so that it was basically owned or we had voting rights as members. My opinion on this is that if there is a split in the cohorts of reform, why can't we have a vote on it? And I just went on, while I was actually waiting, when I spoke to one of your counterparties when it was put me on hold, I went onto Company's House, and I went onto Company's House and I checked it, and it still said that Zia Youssef and Nigel Farage are the two directors of the company, okay?
Okay.
So my thing with this is that I don't want to get rid of Nigel Farage. I think that he is the figurehead of this company, this party, should I say? And it really wrenches me to have to lose Rupert as well as Ben and Beeb as well. To be fair, but who is this Zia Youssef? Because he came in originally, and I thought to myself, this guy's articulate. He's run a business. He sounds good. He's talking the right talk. But it seems like he put a 200,000 investment into or a donation, should I say? Not even an investment, a donation into reform. Next thing you know, he's the chairman of the party. And now he's a director of the company. So my thing is, why don't we put it to the vote of the members? Put it to a vote. Because my thing is that he is the catalyst here. I feel like everything that's gone on for the last couple of days, especially with the police now investigating Rupert and all these things coming out about, bullying and such forth, and, if it's believed that Rupert, with I believe he's got 6 or 7 members of staff that have basically written and said that, you know, he's never done anything. He's always been kind to us, and that it's almost like a coup de grace, you know, with regards to. And I believe it's coming from Zia Yusuf. So my thing is, why don't we put it to a vote to the members?
Well, Zia Yusuf, I think, was kind of brought in to almost professionalise the party. And then Nick Candy, of course, has thrown lots of money into it. But I think Yusuf's point was that, or purpose, was that he would add that kind of a certain strictness to it, a certain discipline, to it, where that it lacked before, something that Nigel as the leader couldn't be across all the time. So the managerial side of it, that's, I think, the purpose. But
absolutely, Ian. And as a business person myself, I totally understand that. But
oh, he's gone. He's disappeared. Well, it was Ben, yes. Ben, thank you. I was about to say David. David Essex. No, it's not him. Ben in Essex. Ben, you got your point across. You weren't cut off, if you're listening. That's all I can think. I was just looking as well at the live membership ticker of Reform UK members. 219,648 is the number. And they make the claim on the front page of their website, join Britain's fastest growing political party. If we get to 309,000, we will overtake Labour's membership and become the largest political party in the UK. Well, largest by members. I mean, not largest by electors, not largest by political representation in Parliament. But I take the point. That would be huge. It's huge they've taken over the Tories in that respect. 219,648 is the number. You're listening to Talk. It's just gone 3:30. A reminder of that breaking news in the last hour. Kyle Clifford, the man who murdered 3 members of the same family in Hertfordshire, will never be released from prison. The 26-year-old attacked his ex-girlfriend Louise, her sister Hannah, with a crossbow and fatally stabbed her mum, Carol. The judge, Mr Justice Benathan, says he is satisfied Clifford planned and contemplated killing all 3 of his victims. Let's listen to the judge.
The evidence I have heard shows you to be a jealous man, soaked in self-pity, a man who holds women in utter contempt. This is no occasion to subject the family and friends of your victims to any delay or suspense. I therefore make clear at once that for each of these 3 murders, the sentence will be one of life imprisonment with a whole life order. That means a sentence from which you will never be released.
They are fairly rare whole life sentences, but if ever there was a case where one should apply, it is here. 3 whole life tariffs. In addition, because of the way our legal system works, there were other offences that you often think, well, if you've got 3 whole life sentences, does it matter about possession or anything like that? But it really does in terms of law, particularly on this additional crime, which was also horrific. He was sentenced to 20 years. For raping Louise. This is his ex-girlfriend. So that was carried out before killing her. He gets 20 years for that. He gets 1 year for possession of a crossbow, 1 year for possession of a knife, 8 years for force imprisonment. But all of that, in terms of sentencing, runs concurrently with the whole life tariff. He will never be released. He's currently in Belmarsh jail. He refused to appear. Even via video link, something I'm never comfortable with. There was apparently an option to have him restrained and brought into court. The judge declined this. It's a difficult one for a judge. I can sort of see, we've talked about this before, you could create a kind of pantomime out of this if somebody is there, you know, unless you're going to gag them as well, and that's not something I think would be allowed. I don't know how you would do it. A big part of it, I've always felt quite strongly, I know some lawyers disagree with this, that I've always felt strongly about being in the courtroom and seeing and hearing a sentence is part of the justice system. Seeing and hearing a sentence, being in the same room as the family of the victims, those whose lives you took, being there is kind of almost the central component to that final moment of justice being served. That said, I do understand that if you're going to have some, we saw it with the Southport case, if someone's going to start making noises and shouting and screaming and disrupting, you sort of potentially dilute the seriousness of this as well. And no one wants that to happen with such a horrific case. Wholly appropriate that he should get those sentences. I know there will be people saying, well, why don't we just have another sentence where you just kill somebody who's done this? That ain't going to happen, by the way, anytime soon. 0344 499 1000. This is Talk.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
It is Talk. 0344 499 1000. So let's move to this. It's another interesting subject where you never meet anybody that has a different view other than on social media. Fitness instructor and influencer Natalie Barnett has sparked a bit of a backlash after banning transgender women from her new Wandsworth gym, calling it a single-sex space for biological women. She originally planned to include trans women but changed her mind, fueling a wider debate over single-sex places. She shared her reasoning with her millions of TikTok followers. Let's have a listen to what Natalie said.
Essentially, I posted a video and I said that my women's only gym, the girl spot, will be operating as a single sex space. So it'll be female only. So at this current time, it won't be trans inclusive. And I want to preface and say that this decision was not made lightly. It took me 4 years to make this decision, and I spent a great deal of time speaking to trans women. I spoke to charities, I spoke to Muslim women, I spoke to so many different communities about this topic. And what really saddens me is that so many people are saying that I'm transphobic. I thoroughly researched. I seeked legal advice. I spoke to communities. I spoke to trans women themselves, which I found very important to do so, to see how to navigate all of this, because I am not trans. So obviously the decision to make it was not based on excluding any individuals. It wasn't based on malice, nothing of the sort.
And you can define yourself on what you are pro rather than what you're against. And, you know, a single-sex spaces, I don't think... To be honest, I think she sort of over-justified her position. I don't think she needed to say that. I think it's a rather simple, this is a space for women. It's that, right? Not hard to get your head around. Connie Shaw, political commentator who feels very strongly about this kind of stuff. Connie, I hope I haven't spoken for you in those last comments, but I'm pretty sure that's broadly where you're at as well on this one.
Hi, Ian. Yes, I mean, it's another week and another woman is being harassed and called a bigot online for believing in the biological reality of sex. And it's such a shame because clearly in that video, Natalie is being extremely reasonable. And like you said, it's a bit ridiculous that she's having to justify herself. But this is the climate that we now live in. Women have to justify why it is that they want to exclude males, which she has every right to do so under the Equality Act. As you say, Natalie originally said in 2021, when she launched her project, that it would be trans inclusive. And the reason that this has all had a bit of traction over the last couple of days is because the gym is set to open very soon in this spring. And she was getting a lot of criticism from gender critical feminists online who were saying, you say this is a women's only gym, but you're also going to allow men in who identify as women. And she decided to address her past comments and clarify that she had changed her mind. And it just really shows how polarised the whole debate is, because all of a sudden, she now has the full support of gender critical feminists, and now she has an entourage of abuse from trans rights activists who are calling her transphobic and a bigot.
Yeah, and you know from your own experience what this looks like when you translate it into kind of social media terms. I mean, these are not people who've got a sort of a vague, sort of tacit disagreement. These are people that want her dead almost because of this. I mean, the volume and the vile nature of some of the voices that rock up, often anonymously, but sometimes, and curiously, not, but very robust, pretty horrendous comments aimed at her for having the audacity to recognise what a single-sex space is. I mean, it shouldn't be that. I often say this, you know, if you'd had this argument 15 years ago, people have been laughing you out the pub, going, what, really? She got in trouble for that? Perfectly standard stuff, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's been really horrific to see some of the comments she's been receiving. She's received multiple death threats, people being extremely racist towards her for doing this. I mean, one thing that is an issue that I think she will have to deal with is the fact that she's received thousands of pounds in donations for her gym. And those people have been donating up until this point under the impression that it was a trans-inclusive gym. And lots of people are asking for their money back. I know certainly if I had donated to a gym that had said that it would be biological women only, and then they changed their mind to say it was trans-inclusive, which means that men were allowed in, I'd want my money back too. And I think that is possibly a reasonable complaint from these people who've made these donations. Yeah,
that's fair enough. And hopefully she'll be able to return that money too. And hopefully it's not the bulk of the money in any respect either. But, I mean, again, these are conversations that would have just looked all shades of upside down half an hour ago. And yet, you know, here we are arguing and, you know, attempting to put a case across for single-sex spaces, and particularly a gym as well. I mean, I think, you know, that in itself is quite specific in this debate, in that gyms, changing rooms, you know, how people dress, etc. I mean, the idea that, you know, a bloke with a beard, I'm sorry I'm being stereotypical here, who still has a penis but calls himself a woman, could sit there on the treadmill next to you is frankly obscene.
Well, yeah, lots of people are saying, so how is she going to enforce this? Is she going to be doing genital inspections on the way in? But it's such a ridiculous argument to make, because it's suggesting that the only way to stop men who identify as women from entering the gym is to do a genital inspection, which suggests that trans women or men who identify as women are purposefully and knowingly going to transgress the boundaries that this woman has set for her gym.
Indeed. I mean, the story, as you say, it could end badly, potentially, for Natalie, because, you know, we know that those voices in some elements of the politicised trans community are very loud and very threatening and menacing. And, you know, she's a successful woman. She might just think this is just too much. You know, I've kind of lost the battle, and I fear for my safety and the safety of those around me.
Well, the thing is, and it was my experience as well, when things like this happen, it often can have a really silver lining. And I really hope that, you know, the big dog TERFs are in touch with her. I feel particularly smug about this whole case because only last week, Natalie did a talk at Leeds University Union before she made the announcement that it was for only biological women. And I really wonder whether Leeds University would have platformed her knowing that they were essentially platforming something that wasn't inclusive, which we all know is one of their dearly held values.
Well, yeah, you know how that particular university can respond to certain situations. So my money is on the fact that she would have been completely deplatformed and person non grata by about 6 o'clock.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I really do, because it was so well received by students as well. I'm really interested to know how those students might feel about it now. I'm really interested to know how the union now feels about that, knowing that they have platformed and celebrated someone who shares relatively similar views to me, that biological sex matters and that women should be able to have single-sex spaces.
That some of those people won't be sleeping now. They'll be discombobulating, melting like the Wicked Witch does on The Wizard of Oz. The mere idea that somebody has a different opinion, and a real opinion, a scientific opinion, different to theirs. Listen, Connie, always great to have you on. Thank you, Connie Shaw, political commentator who's been through her own ups and downs and arguments about what happens when you put your head above the parapet and state that biological sex is real, etc. None of this is and should never be about being unfair, unpleasant to trans people. I don't know a single person, I'm sure they're out there, but I don't know a single person who looks at it that way. I understand people have their own reasons for transitioning. People have done it for years and lived their lives, the majority of their lives, the opposite gender to the one they were born with. I get all of that. We all understand that. It isn't about what you're anti, it's about what you're pro. You can, notwithstanding all of that, you can still say, there's a gym and that's a women-only space, okay? And this is an area. I don't even think, I've never gone down that argument that, you know, what about the potential that you could be sexually assaulted by a man in the changing room. I don't think that is the most authentic or persuasive argument here. I don't think it's about that. I don't imagine, and I'm not suggesting those cases haven't happened. We have clear-cut evidence where sometimes it has. I don't think the average trans woman is a sex offender, all right? But that's not the group that we're worried about, all right, in that respect. But it is about, regardless of all of that, it's about a woman saying this is a woman-only space, and you can recognise and respect the right of any. I don't care how somebody wants to identify. I genuinely do not care. There's nothing I care less about than this. But that doesn't mean you can't simultaneously have a view that there should be such a thing as a woman-only space. And there is a lived experience as a woman that you're never going to get. And being a woman, by the way, is not about putting on makeup and doing your hair a certain way. That is not what defines a woman, the journey of a woman, the backstory of a woman, the biological nature of being a woman and all that goes with it. That's not it, okay? Germaine Greer talks brilliantly about this, and I think she's been no platformed, and nobody could be a more high-profile global feminist than Germaine Greer, for goodness sake. But that's where it's kind of got to, that even she's seen as controversial. She makes that point, that is not, the essence of being a woman is not just looking like a woman. I could probably do that. We've got some talented makeup people here. I reckon they could get me madged up by about, 4 o'clock this afternoon. I'd be slightly convincing. It's none of that stuff. It's not about buying a handbag or picking out a skirt. It's not about the way you sit or the kind of stuff that interests you. It's not about femininity either. The whole journey and backstory of being a woman is very specific, like it is with being a man. I think there are perhaps even more persuasive arguments about the backstory of a woman. And when it gets to things like women's refuges and things like that, I mean, I think that's a very clear-cut case where you wouldn't go near saying that anyone was born a man. There could be no possible way. I don't have the experience of being a woman. I don't know what that feels like. You read stats that nearly every woman around has at some stage at varying levels suffered some kind of whether it's an overt sexual assault or whether it's a kind of sexualized comment, whether it's the look, the idea that a man talks to your breasts and not your face and all of this kind of stuff. A bloke in a skirt has not experienced that. I'm sorry, these are all relevant factors in all of this. And that's just the obvious stuff. It goes much deeper. 0344 499 1000. A little bit of breaking news on the back of that oil tanker and cargo ship crash yesterday. The inferno that ensued. We've now been told a man has been arrested on suspicion of gross negligence manslaughter. On suspicion of gross negligence manslaughter following that crash off the coast of East Yorkshire yesterday. More details on the way. Back with you in a couple of moments' time. 12 minutes to 4 o'clock. This is Talk.
If there's someone who's been consistently wrong, I'm afraid it's Ed Miliband, and his energy policies are just ruinous. I mean, in my brief for business, I mean, there's just no way that British business, particularly manufacturing, can compete on a world stage with the sort of energy prices that we've had. Now, you know, obviously some of that is due to world affairs, to be fair, but he's making it worse, not better. Consistently.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
It is Talk, 8 minutes to 4. Jeremy Carl's here at 4. He's going to pop in before then to give us some detail about what's happening on the big Drive Time show. Matt's in Cheshire. What have you got for us, Matt? Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Ian. Can I just read my thoughts out? I wrote them down for speed.
I like it. I like it. There's nothing more than a bit of due diligence when making a phone call.
It's amateur hour for reform. Lowe and Habib are not bog standard hoi polloi politicians. They are generational talents saying the things that millions want at the exact time we need them most to salvage Britain for its citizens. I went to a few reform meetings early in the year. I could not be more enthused, engaged and aware of what's needed to help my fellow residents in my constituency. There was no vision for my town or local awareness. I have both.
it was more about top-down party structure and directives and meaningless titles. I felt Reform were ruining a generational chance to get Labour out in my area, so decided it's independence all the way for me. I will vote Reform, like, nationally, and I won't vote for any of the other three main parties ever again. But as far as local sort of awareness is concerned, they seem quite selfish.
That's interesting that there's, yeah, I mean, I've heard of like some constituency offices that they set up and now are no longer there, or there's perhaps no support on the ground. Is that fair?
That's what's happened to mine. It's being basically put with Angela Rayner's in Ashton-under-Lyne. They're being incorporated into each other. The first time I went, there were about 20-odd people there, and then a few weeks later, there were about 5 people there. People were losing interest because they weren't really talking about local issues.
Yeah, and that's the trouble, because you've got to, I know it's hard graft for individuals involved, and particularly the metropolitan bubble that kind of, you know, don't think about places outside the area where they live, or even the street where they live on some occasions. But if you don't get to the communities and the constituencies, and I know it's a hard ask for a new party to be everywhere, but you've got to show some intention.
We were all there, though. That's what I'm saying. There were people from my town all there telling them their little structure of people who weren't from the town.
Yeah.
They were more interested in sort of, we need to do this, and we're like saying, no, if you just support us in what we think, you're waltzing. You know, just at council level, I mean, you know, we weren't even talking about parliamentary seats or anything like that. So it was a bit of a farce, if I'm honest with you.
Do you think that can be kind of rectified in some way, in the sense that, I mean, some might be listening to this going, well, look, they can't be everywhere, so if they're merging a couple of areas and having one office, then that sort of makes some sense.
Yeah, I mean, not really. The people were there. Everyone was up for it. It was just like, just get rid of titles and sort of just everyone's in. It doesn't matter who gets the credit as long as we all chip in for the greater good, if you know what I mean, for the time being.
Yeah, that's how it should be. Listen, great call as ever, Matt. Thank you, Matt in Cheshire. And Tom from Yorkshire says, any party that renames itself to State 51 and stands on a manifesto to become the 51st state of America has my vote. We need a constitution just like the US. Yeah, although it's not all tickety-boo over there in the US. This whole tariff thing is not...
It's a bit better than being in this country.
Well, yeah, certainly Florida, where it's a bit warmer.
These have got somebody who actually says, I'm going to do something and does it.
Well, that's all.
Meanders around.
It's kind of all people want, really.
How are you?
I'm good.
I've had a haircut.
You've had a haircut?
It's all good. I've got a big spot on my nose.
Did you?
You know that moment when you've got a spot on your nose and there's nothing you can do about it because you could get and I don't quite know why. I'm 60. I shouldn't be going through puberty.
Yeah, why did we? why do you get spots when you're older? What's all that about? I thought that goes away, doesn't it?
Painfully, it doesn't when you get to my age. Anyway, it's lovely. It's the first day of the Cheltenham Festival. I've had 2 winners. Looking forward to the show.
You love a nag, don't you?
I love a nag. Yeah, I'm married to one. Ba-bum! Yay! You see what I did there?
I wish I knew anything about, you know, as Ryan, your producer, said, does each way mean that the horse runs and then runs back again?
I was very lucky for years. I was very involved in racing.
I know.
I've been.
Can you make money out of racing?
We got really lucky for a long time. Not gambling, with the horse, that turned out to be a superstar. So we really got into it.
Red Run.
Yeah. Black Cordon ran 35 times and won 17 races. Never out the top 3.
Yeah.
Just doesn't happen, does it? But
that's true.
Just lovely. Great day out.
It is a night. I've only been once.
I know, because you got drunk and made a fool of yourself and had to be escorted out of the race course. You disgraced you and your mate Sophie. Disgraceful behaviour.
Do you remember that? Yeah, well, let's not relive that.
No.
Moment.
I'm in the car park, ladies and gentlemen, one day of a well-known supermarket, and Ian Collins says, could you say hello to a friend of mine? She's in my kitchen and she's giving me grief. Sophie was extraordinary, wasn't she?
She was.
She's still married?
She's married, yeah.
Shocking.
She still talks about you.
Does she?
She does.
She's only human. So listen, this reform thing does not go away. Police launching a Rupert Lowe investigation on the same day that 7 staff that work for him in the House of Commons come out and say he's a wonderful man, he's quality, He treated us all very interestingly. Musk could back a low breakaway party. I think the issue here is, and I think Mike got it dead right this morning on breakfast when he said, there's a lot of people, we had this on Drive yesterday, feeling cheated, feeling like they've put their faith in this, and is it down to ego? That is something that we are going to look at.
Absolutely.
Throughout the show. Loads. I mean, you know, where do I start? Gender backlash on CPR guidance, my favourite story of the day. Campaigners have accused the St John's Ambulance of raising women after they issued official CPR guidance referring to people with breasts. Now, I don't...
Seriously?
Yeah, I don't mean to be rude. If you're giving mouth-to-mouth with a person with breasts, it could be a fat bloke who likes a curry quite regularly and beer.
Yeah, I mean, I've been in a few rough pubs where blokes have been there in their T-shirts with Hooters to die for.
Hooters, moobs to die for. So
somebody, John in Sutton says, Ian, if you put on makeup and decide to live as a woman, I just want you to know I will still listen to your show, says John, who's a faithful
Can I
listener.
just point out something?